So folks, let's talk about this course in and of itself. As I said, this is post-licensing 302, which is contracts and closings. Very important part of our job. Yeah, we all have a license, and so if you want to make money, you've got to help people buy and sell or lease real estate in order to eventually collect some compensation. Well, part of every facet of real estate is dealing with contracts, and most of you are probably in residential sales or commercial sales, and either way, sales require getting to closing. And so that's where this course kind of focuses. The contracts that entitle you to getting paid, right? Because you get these sales contracts, you've done your job, you get to closing. So very, very important discussions to be had in this course. So let me tell you about the breakdown of this course as it flows. There are 6 sections. Section 1 is basic selected contract law concepts. Now that's going to sound very familiar. It's going to be a more in-depth recap of some of the contracts discussions we had in pre-licensing. Valid, voidable, void, all those different things, executed, executory. Real estate sales contract preparation is where we're going to spend the most time. This is where we actually have conversations about the sales contract itself, the most commonly utilized one, and then how to fill it out, how it works, all the different provisions within, so you understand the good, the bad, the ugly that's in that contract. We will also talk about different addenda and amendments and documents that we will use on a regular basis as real estate professionals in North Carolina, specifically Realtor members eventually. Or currently. Sales contract procedures basically talks about things that happen, from contract to close, ways that we handle offers, ways that we handle counter offers, negotiations, due diligence periods, things of that nature. Section 4, closing preparations and procedures, what leads up after due diligence going to close, reviewing settlement statements, discussing with attorneys, making sure that you evaluate repairs, anything in that regard. Now, Section 5 is a big one, at least word-wise. If you look at that line, that's a lot of words from a word count point of view. So it says TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule, which we call TRID for short. It's very inception-y. It is an acronym with an acronym inside an acronym. So the TILA RESPA Integrated Disclosure Rule and Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. So this is where we talk about, kind of the important pieces for us as real estate brokers in regard to TRID and RESPA. And so, of course, we kind of talk about TILA just a touch in there. But most of that is attorney and lenders that need to be aware of those things. But there's a few items that we're going to cover in that section. Now, Section 6, called the Settlement Statement section. Folks, that is where we get into settlement statement, closing disclosure, HUD-1, whatever you want to call it. Now, I'm going to provide some clarity on the differentiation between those terms as we get into the day. But that's where the math comes into play. The itemized statement that shows all the credits and the debits on the buyer side and the seller side and the way that the money's all flows. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If I waited until the chronological sequence of events to get to Section 6, that would put us on like the last day of class. I'm not going to do that because that would mean I was a very bad person. You would hate my guts if I waited till the last day to teach you the math and then expected you to be tested on it, okay? I'm not going to do that to you. So we will actually start learning the settlement statement and some of the math that goes into it as early as tomorrow. And so you'll get exposure to the math tomorrow, next Monday, and next Tuesday leading up to the test. You'll get 3 days of it. And you might even get a little bit of it today depending on how the day flows. But just be aware, when we get to that section, it's just going to be a quick recap because I will basically have smattered it into the rest of the sections in some way, shape, and form. Now, Section 7, called Other Topics, this is where we typically will plug in license and education things. How do you keep your license current and active and all that jazz. There's a little bit of that, and then we also talk about the alternate conveyance contracts, which we discussed briefly in pre-licensing. Land contract, also called a contract for deed, and then we'll talk about the preemptive rights, right of first refusal, right of first opportunity to purchase, purchase money mortgage, things like that, just miscellaneous things. So that is how this course will flow. And of course, the way that y'all's is set up, it'll go by pretty fast because we just have the 4 structured days. And we'll talk about, kind of the breaks and the structure here in a little bit. Now, as I've said before, I have met a lot of you fine folks, and I am so excited to have you back in my classroom. But for those of you who haven't met me before, my name is Seth Chauncey, and I am not only your instructor, I am the education director for HPW Real Estate School. And so let me just give you a little bit of insight into myself. I have been a real estate broker for 8 years, all in North Carolina. I live in the Triangle area in a little town called Willow Springs. And so if you're not familiar, that's right on the Wake County, Johnston County border. And so most of my business is Wake County, Johnston County, Harnett County. I've done some Durham, some Chatham, some Orange, depending on the timing. And then in regard to the professional experience, I've done a lot of different things in real estate. I have done general brokerage. I have managed teams. I have done recruiting, tech training, managed as a broker in charge. I have worked for a developer, managed a new construction sales team. I've done a lot of different things. So I like to say that I know a lot about a little or a little about a lot, depending on who you ask. And so I am hopefully going to be a plethora of knowledge for you fine folks. Now here's the cool thing. In pre-licensing, as much as it pains me to say it as an educator, the whole purpose of pre-licensing was to help you pass the test. Post-licensing, a little bit more than that. Now you've got your license, and so we're going to actually have time to talk about real-world scenarios. You can bring questions. We can talk about them. We can do some of those rabbit hole discussions that everybody was just itching to do in pre-licensing, but we didn't have time to do. So a lot of good information that we will go over in this class, and so always feel free to ask questions because this is the time to ask them. Post-licensing is kind of an important class in that regard. Now, as you can see here, this is my contact information. All of you have already received an email from me, which gave you the access to this class. So you've got it if you didn't notice it. But of course, you can save it as well. You can always email me with any questions, comments, concerns about class or otherwise. I joke that once you take my class, I always look at you and say, we're friends for life, whether you like it or not after you've taken my classes. So if you've ever got any questions, comments, anything I can help you with, I'm always happy to help. Do give me some time though. I have a lot of emails and text messages every day. And don't be afraid to poke and prod me if I don't respond in a week. And you're like, Seth, you didn't respond to me. And you just send it again. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Because sometimes it gets bombarded in my email. Now, if you ever email me for advice, here's the thing, folks. It's good advice. It's friendly advice. But it's not legal advice, okay? I am not an attorney, so don't ask me to be one because I cannot give legal advice in any way, shape, and form. I can give you some really good brokerage advice, though, so you're always welcome to email me or text me and ask for that. That being said, that is my cell phone number as well. Not a Google number, not a school number, my personal cell phone number. So if you've never texted me before, though, and you decide to text me, make sure you tell me who you are, right? Never fails. How the student texts me like, hey, Seth, I got a question about this, and this. I'm like, great, happy to help. Who is this? Oh, God, sorry, this is such and such. I took your class 3 years ago. I'm like, okay, that's helpful. Thank you. I didn't know who you were if you took my class 3 years ago and you've never texted me before. So make sure that you let me know. So definitely keep my contact information. You can always reach out to me. And we're going to meet you fine folks in just a moment. So I got one more thing, or should I say 2 more things to really delve into before we kick off the actual lecture for the day, okay? First one is this. Why post-licensing education? Well, folks, the main reason for all of you as you sit in here right now is because you have to. The Real Estate Commission looks at you and says you have to move from a provisional broker to a full broker if you want to continue to use your license in North Carolina. So that's your main reason for being here. But more than that, I told you, pre-licensing was to help you pass a test. Post-licensing, we can have real-world discussions on best practices, what to do, what not to do, to help protect you, to have a long-lived real estate career, to help protect the public from you, so you have a long-lived real estate career, and to provide some more fine-tuning and expertise on practical things that are important in your real estate career. That's why we have to do post-licensing, which is why I said let's take advantage of it, right? We really need to use this opportunity wisely to become very well-versed in things that are important to you and your clients. So here's where I like to start the day, just to drive a point home as to why this class is so important. I've already done that a little bit with that crossword puzzle, but this is a segment that I have introduced into my post-licensing classes for the past, specifically my post 302 class for the past couple years. And it always provides some good discussions and gives me an opportunity, as I just said, to tell you why this class is so important to you. So I like to call this segment What Had Happened Was. So here's the deal. I want you to take a second and I want you to think about it to see if you recall, whether it be from personal experience, you and your business, somebody in your firm, or otherwise, a situation that you may have heard about where something went awry. The contract did not happen the way it was supposed to happen. Closing didn't happen the way it was supposed to. Somebody missed out on something. Negotiations got nasty. There was confusion. I want you to think about a time that you may have heard that happening and share it with us, because sometimes we make a mess just because we weren't clear. Now, if you don't have any of them, I've got a couple I'm going to share with you, but I want to give you a second to think about it. If any of you have ever heard one, like I said, you've done it. When you bought a house, when you helped somebody in your office told you about something, right? Something didn't happen the way it was supposed to because we weren't clear enough on the contract. Anybody got one?
Well, moving happens all the time. New construction, move-in day, that happens all the time.
All the time. And so it's very important to read into the contract how much time a builder has to delay, how much time the buyer has to delay, because some of these contracts are written not very friendly that, they say, nope, you got to move in the day that we say. You got to close the day we say. So that's a big one. Anybody got any?
Seth, are you looking for something like what would allow you to void a contract? So let's say, it was new construction, but things were delayed beyond what the contract stated.
That could absolutely be one, right? So let me give you an example based on that. Things that went south because we weren't very well versed in the contract. So in Steve's example, new construction, some builders put in there that if the buyer can't close within 3 days of the builder's set date, that the builder can turn around and terminate on you and keep all your money. It's very important to know that these things are in the contract. Do you think there are buyers out there that got terminated on by builders over a couple of days and lost all their money? Absolutely. Do you think there are buyers out there who got shafted because the builders were allowed to, work on it for an extra 6 months without being in breach because the contract said so, and they had nowhere to move and had to rent another place for 6 months? Happens all the time, right? Any others y'all can think of? And if not, I'll give you a really good story to kick off the day. All right, here's the deal, okay? I want you to picture this. Every single one of you, let's say that you get a phone call from a potential buyer. Husband and wife want to go see a house. So you sign a buyer agency agreement, you go and start showing them homes, and you find one, and you take them to it, okay? So you go and you show them this house, and they are loving it, okay? The wife is walking through the house, and she's just oohing and an ahhing, right? Oh my God, I love this house. This is where my arts and crafts are going to go. This is where the baby's nursery is going to go. This is my dream home. And she looks over to her husband. She says, babe, isn't this the best house ever? He says, yeah, babe, if you love it, I love it, right? He's just being a good husband. He's just amenable and everything's just going great. And they love the house. And you're excited because you're about to get a big contract, or your first contract maybe. And so you're walking through the house and they're just talking about all the features and they love it. And so then they get to the kitchen and the husband gets excited. He's like, whoa, babe, get in here. Come look at this kitchen. And the wife goes in there, and you go in there to see what's going on. And the husband is all excited about the refrigerator. Oh, folks, it is this beautiful black stainless steel refrigerator made by Samsung. And he's excited because he recognizes it. He saw the commercial. It's one of those refrigerators that's so smart, it makes those whiskey ice balls. So you actually have these beautiful custom whiskey ice balls in the bottom freezer compartment that you can drop in your rocks glass, pour your good whiskey over it, and he's excited. Babe, this is that refrigerator that makes those whiskey eyeballs, or ice balls. Remember I told you? I saw it on TikTok. This is the coolest thing ever. Oh, God, I want one of these so bad. And so the husband looks at you, the agent, and he says, does the refrigerator come with the house? And you being the smart agent that you are, what are you going to say?
You have to put that in the contract to request it.
There you go. We all know that in North Carolina, the refrigerator is actually considered personal property. But you being the smart agent, you say, well, listen, we can ask for it and put it in the contract to see if they're willing to give it to us. And the husband says, great, let's do that. And so you say, okay. So you go and they want to put an offer in. You draft up the offer and you put in there that you want the refrigerator. And you send the offer over and it gets under contract. Oh, happy days. The wife's excited. The husband's excited. You're excited. Okay? And things go on. And so you go and you have a home inspection and you get through all the hoops. And then you get there on the day of the final walkthrough leading up to closing. And you're walking through the house just as giddy as a clam because you are about to have a closing. You know your people are excited. This is the perfect house for them. And then what happens is you get to the kitchen. And when you walk in there, the husband is in absolute shock. He just stops in his tracks and he looks over there. And where his beautiful black stainless steel refrigerator was, it's gone. And what's in its place is a dirty, dingy, old school, white, linoleum looking refrigerator. And his jaw just drops and he's, what is that? Why is that there? Where's my whiskey ice ball refrigerator? Where is it? You said that we got it. Why is that refrigerator there? And you're just sitting there and you're just so confused. You're like, I don't know. I don't know. We asked for the refrigerator. Let me call the listing agent. And here's what you do. You pick up the phone and you call the listing agent, okay? And you are upset and you are distraught and you are angry. And when you call the listing agent, here's what you're informed of. No. On the contract, you asked for a refrigerator. You got a refrigerator. You didn't notice that refrigerator was in the garage in the corner. We left you that when you asked for a refrigerator. We just put it in the kitchen for you to help you out. Now, folks, on the contract, you put refrigerator. In the house, you got refrigerator. Guess what? You have no recourse. You know what else? You're about to buy the most expensive closing gift you have ever bought in your life. About $4,000 if you didn't know how much those whiskey ice ball refrigerators cost. Why? Because you weren't clear in the contract. Folks, there is no room for ambiguity. You've got to make contracts stupid proof. What you should have put in the contract is the black stainless French door refrigerator made by Samsung in home at time of showing, model number SP5677823PQRTSV7730. But you didn't. You asked for a refrigerator, you got refrigerator. Folks, that is a very painful mistake to make as a newly licensed broker, and I promise you only make it once. Because when you buy that $4,000 refrigerator, it will eat away at you for the rest of your life. You know what's going to happen, right? 10 years after that transaction, you're going to be going to make yourself a ham sandwich and you're just going to stop and stare at your refrigerator and you're just going to be taken back to that moment and you're just going to be festering looking at it. And your spouse is going to walk up and they're like, you okay over there? And you're just going to be festering. And you're like, that stupid refrigerator. I can't believe I had to buy that $4,000 refrigerator. And your spouse is going to say, shut up. That was 10 years ago. Just make your ham sandwich and close the refrigerator door. And you're just going to be mad about it. Folks, this class is extremely important because if you don't know how to fill out a contract, you are opening yourself up to a world of hurt. You're opening your clients up to a world of hurt. I promise you are. And when you assume things, when you make mistakes, it costs you money. It costs you credibility. It costs you clients. It's not good. And it happens all the time. I've been teaching this for years. I can't tell you how many students make these mistakes. And sometimes you learn the hard way, but it's my hope, my want, my desire that you're going to learn in this classroom as opposed to learning the hard way. We've all made the mistakes, but this is not like your mama and daddy where you have to make them yourself. Let me help you not make the mistakes to try to save you some face and save you some money. Now let's play a fun game just to really articulate another reason why this class is so important. Now this is a smaller group, so it may not go the way that I want it to go, but we're going to test this out. And then I will give you the reason as to why I'm asking you to do this. I want every single one of you to go to the chat box really quick. I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it in the chat. Don't unmute, just put it in the chat, okay? Type it in and put it to everyone. Is a shed personal property or real property? Put it in the chat. Personal, 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 personal. One, two, three, four, five. Folks, I just had just about every single one of you answer personal, okay? I want you to listen to me right now, and I want you to hear why this class is so important. In a room full of real estate professionals, I just asked you to tell me whether a shed was personal property or real property. Every single one of you said personal. You're all wrong. It's real property. No ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts. Because the other answer I always get, well, it depends on how it's attached. It doesn't. It doesn't. Do you think this class is important? Because if any of you had just written a contract as a listing agent and assumed that it was personal property and you told your seller that they could take it with them, you would have been dealing with a lawsuit at closing because the buyers are entitled to it. You see why this is important? Folks, let me show you this just to really paint this picture for you. Give me 2 seconds. I'm going to show you something.
So that shed that's purchased at Lowe's or Home Depot, that's brought to the site, that's set up on cinder blocks and sits about 2 feet in the air, is real property.
It's real property. It is 1,000% real property. I will show you. Right here. Folks, in pre-licensing, the generalization for is it real property or personal property, in other words, is it a fixture or not, was fixtures are typically nailed, screwed, glued, or buried. It is not that simple in the real world. Okay? It's not. It is, well, I guess I should not say it's not that simple. It's actually more straightforward. That is a broad generalization, and it's not enough. In the real world, we utilize lists. We have to be so specific. I'm trying to get this zoomed in for you. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to show you exactly why. Here we go. Why is this not? I'm just going to open it this way so I can zoom in for you. There we go. So look right here, and we're going to spend a lot of time, so this is just a real quick, just me making a point. When you look at this sales contract, which we use in almost all the transactions, not all, but almost all, buyer and seller agree that the following items, if present on the property on the date of the offer, shall be included in the sale as part of the purchase price free of liens, unless excluded in subparagraphs D or E below. I want you to look right here. Storage shed, utility building. Does that say anything about what it's constructed of? Does that say anything about how it's sitting? Does that say anything about where it's located, how much it costs, or anything like that? So a shed is a fixture, no matter which way you slice it.
Let me give you a real live example.
Okay.
And I just want to know the answer.
Sure.
You're in the country, and on your property you have a trailer, a 40-foot trailer that used to be pulled behind a tractor on the highway. And these people, it's full of lawn tools, everything. That's their storage shed. But it still has the wheels. It still has the license plate, although it's not good anymore because they haven't paid for it. Is that included here?
So here's the deal, folks, and I'm glad you asked this question. Phil, folks, listen to me very carefully, okay? Watch my mouth. This list is very comprehensive, but do you think it's possible for us to touch on everything in this list? No. It is impossible to touch on everything that could possibly arise at every single transaction. So here is the most important thing to understand about contracts. Make them stupid proof. Because Phil, somebody could probably argue that it is part of it. Somebody could equally argue that it isn't. If we're arguing, we've lost already because Judge Judy gets to decide when we're arguing. All you have to do is come right down here under other items that do not convey. 40-foot trailer with wheels and tag in yard holding all storage equipment does not convey and will be taken with the seller. Spell it out. That's it. That's all we have to do. When I talked about that refrigerator and you want to ask for personal property, don't just put refrigerator. Refrigerator and home at time of showing, you've got to spell it out. Because, folks, let me give you another reason as to why this is so important. This contract changes basically every year. They reevaluate it and they say, okay, was there anything we need to change based on ambiguities, lawsuits, or otherwise? Well, there was a couple changes in July of last year. And one of the biggest ones was this was added. Exercise equipment / devices that are attached. Let me tell you why that one got added. There was a couple of contracts where there was CrossFit equipment bolted to the wall in the garage. This was not in there last year whenever those transactions happened. Because they were attached, the buyers argued they were fixtures and they were supposed to stay. The seller said, no, they're not, so we took them. Buyers took the sellers to court. The buyers won. They were obligated to leave them. The courts decided they were in fact fixtures because they utilized the total circumstance test. IRMA, intent of the annex or relationship of the annex or method of attachment and adaptation of the real estate. They said it was bolted to the house. It intended to stay and the buyers should have gotten it. Now, I don't know what the reward was, but I'm sure there was some type of damages where they had to pay them for the equipment or otherwise. But because the buyers won and we didn't address this, now we've added it in to make it much more clear that exercise equipment is a fixture unless we agree to otherwise. You've got to make these contracts stupid proof. Very important. See why this is such a good class?
Yeah.
Folks, think about it. Day one, we haven't even made it to lunchtime, and you just learned a couple of things that will probably save you thousands and thousands of dollars in the future and potentially avoid a lawsuit. It's such an important class.
And Seth, with fixtures, I would think that TVs, as it's been for some time now, mounted to the walls, that could, go either way, where you could specify, well, just the mounting stays, but the TV goes, or...
I'm so glad you said that. Let me touch on this. Now, we're going to talk about this more later, but I've had students come through this class and they're like, oh, well, when we, bought our house, the agent told the seller they had to leave their TV, so we got all the TVs in the house. And I said, well, that listing agent was an idiot and did not do a service to their clients. It actually addresses that. Surface mounting brackets for television and speakers, recessed mounted speakers, and mounted intercom systems. The TV bracket is a fixture. The TV itself is personal property. You're expected to remove the TV and leave the mounting bracket up. There you go. So if your agent tells you you have to leave the TV, your agent's stupid. And if you've got a seller that says let me point out something. If you've got a seller who says they want to take their bracket with them, sure, they could exclude it. But folks, that is the dumbest thing they could possibly do. You know what happens when you take down a TV bracket? Terry knows. Yeah, those giant lag bolts. It looks like somebody took a shotgun to it. Folks, guess what happens? If your seller wanted to come in and exclude it, sure. But look what it says right here. Seller must repair any damage caused by removal of any items excluded above in a good and workmanlike manner. Seller will notify buyer upon completion of such repair and provide buyer with documentation thereof, if any. You know how much a really good TV mount is? $100 to $200 for a really, really good one. You know how much it costs to have a painting company come in and fill in lag bolt holes, spackle it, sand it, and paint it? Probably about $700. Leave the stupid TV mount. Buy a new one at the next house. Right? You can take it if you exclude it, but it'd be the dumbest thing you ever did. So we're going to talk about that, right? A lot of really good information in this class. We've got to make contracts stupid proof. Let me tell you one more reason why we got to make contracts stupid proof. Aside from the real world examples I just gave you, folks, you heard this in the news years back. They have to put warnings on Tide Pods to make sure the morons don't eat them. That's the kind of society we're living in nowadays, okay? That we got to tell people not to eat laundry detergent in a gel pack. You've got to make these things stupid proof. Because, listen, I'm going to start a petition to change the name of common sense to not so common sense anymore. Because it ain't common, right? Now, I'm going to give you some other real-world examples as the course goes along, but I think I've made a pretty valid point as to why this class is so important and the value that comes from 302, which is why I love teaching it so much. You have so many aha moments that will just protect you and your clients forever and ever, amen. And I'm going to give you some really good real-world examples as time goes on all these things. So, let's kick this thing off. Also, I really like that little raccoon right there. So Section 1, basic selected contract law concepts. This is where I told you it's going to sound like a lot of recap from pre-licensing, just a little more in depth. Okay, so a lot of these things should sound familiar. So this is where we're going to start. Well, let's just start with a contract, okay? We keep using this word contract. Well, let's make sure you remember what a contract is. Now, there is some very intentional words within this definition. A contract is a deliberate agreement between two or more competent parties supported by legal consideration to perform or abstain from performing some act. That's a contract. Now, folks, those words are, as I said, intentional. All contracts are deliberate, meaning they're voluntary. You have to have competent parties, 18, sane and sober. Have to be supported by something of value, we call it consideration. And then when you get under contract, we have what we call performance, what you're expected to do. Now, as great as this sounds, I'm going to make another very powerful statement. Folks, a contract is only worth anything in one very specific place. Where is that? Where's the only place a contract matters?
If you fail to act.
If you fail to act, but even then, it doesn't really matter much unless we're one specific place.
Court.
Or the law.
Court.
No.
Court. Folks, understand that if I was to make a promise to you right now and you made a promise to me and either one of us didn't fulfill it, we probably don't have any recourse. The whole point of a contract is it's supposed to be powerful enough that we have recourse if you don't follow up with what you said you're going to do. Because think about it, folks. If somebody doesn't adhere to their agreement, you can suck it up. You can try to fight them in the streets, but that's probably going to end up with an assault charge. The only real recourse that you could potentially have is taking somebody to court. So I want you to understand this. If you're not willing to go to court over it, you shouldn't even bother having a contract. So let's tie this into real estate. Do you think there are ever times that a buyer and or a seller do not get everything that they were promised to get? Do you think they ever just say, okay, and just deal with it? Sure.
Yes.
Because not everything is worth going to court over, but the whole point is, if you don't like it and you want to remedy it, you could go to court. That's a contract. If you're never willing to go to court, then don't even bother having a contract. Because we all have to understand that people make promises to each other all the time, and these promises are not fulfilled. And if you're not going to do anything about it, what was the point of having a contract in the first place? Just because you have a contract for your buyer does not mean your buyer will get everything they were promised. Just because you have a contract for your seller does not mean your seller will get everything they were promised. But what it hopefully does is gives them the ability to go to court over it if they don't get what they're promised. That's the point. So let's throw some vocab into the mix from your pre-licensing world, okay? Contracts can be express. Contracts can be implied. Express means stated, folks. That's all express means. Does not mean in writing. If you were to verbally speak it, it's still express. If you were to put it in writing, it would also be express. And so clearly stating what you're going to do and what I'm going to do, whether verbally or in writing, would be an express contract. Now, all of our contracts, even agency agreements, are express in North Carolina. We do not operate any way, shape, or form under implied agreements. But understand right now we're not talking about real estate. We're talking about basic contract law. So implied would be suggested by our actions. Folks, I want you to think about this. I want you to picture going out to eat tonight at a restaurant. All right, and you sit down. Have you ever had a situation where you sit down at a restaurant and the server comes over to you and they say, "Welcome to restaurant. My name is blank. I will be serving you this evening. Please understand that since you have sat down at our restaurant, I will hand you a menu and you will look over the choices. At which point you will make a decision on what looks like something you would desire to consume. Upon informing me of your choice, I will relay it to the kitchen. The kitchen will make said choice. I will bring it out to you for your consumption. Upon completing your food consumption, you will be given a bill, which we expect you to pay in a timely manner, plus gratuity. Here is a contract. Sign here acknowledging that you understand our terms, policies, procedures, and agreement." Has that ever happened to you at a restaurant? That'd be the weirdest thing, wouldn't it? You all know that when you sit down at a Chili's and order some fajitas and some margaritas, folks, that you're going to have to pay for them at the end. That is what we call an implied agreement. Okay? Your actions suggested that you understood the contract. You sat down and ordered food. You, of course, are going to have to pay for said food. Now, please do not think that implied agreements are not enforceable. We're not talking real estate. There are some implied contracts that are very much enforceable in a court of law. If you don't believe me, you try getting up after eating your $90 dinner and walking out without paying. I promise you it's enforceable. They're going to call the popo. They're going to tell you you're going to be banned from that restaurant, and you're probably going to get a fine and a misdemeanor charge because it's less than a certain amount of money, but it's still criminal. So express means stated. Implied means our contract was suggested by our actions. You did this, I did that. We understood what the agreement was.
Seth, a lot of people don't understand that. So over time, you and I have been doing business with each other for, say, 20 years, and we do it a certain way. And then one day, we wake up and say, I'm tired of him, the way he does business. I'm going to do it a different way. The conduct that you two have done, a good attorney can change the outcome of that for you very quickly.
Absolutely. And so that's actually a big part of like the, not so much in North Carolina, but the agency conversation and, pre-licensing, implied agency agreements are recognized in a lot of states because we've always worked together that, I have this apparent authority to work on behalf of you. So apparent authority, implied authority, all of these things are very much recognized in a lot of states because of this pre-existing relationship. You're right. And it's all in the hands of an attorney. Very much. Some implied contracts are absolutely enforceable. Now, since I'm talking about agency, yet again, North Carolina doesn't recognize an agency contract under implied agreement. What would that look like? Get in the car, let's go see some pretty houses. That's an implied agreement. We don't recognize that in North Carolina. All of our agency agreements, even oral buyer agency agreements, have to be express. We have to state the terms in North Carolina. So contracts can be express or implied. Well, contracts can also be unilateral or bilateral. Now, folks, before I show you, who remembers, what does unilateral versus bilateral mean?
One person agrees to unilateral, both parties agree to bilateral.
And there's an extra word to throw into the mix there. One person makes a what?
Offer.
Not an offer. Promise. Yeah. Unilateral is one promise. Bilateral is two promises. I always like to caution people because sometimes people think, oh, well, one party and two parties. Folks, listen to me. You can't have a contract with one party, okay? Doesn't work that way. You know what a contract with one party is? That's called a Weight Watchers contract, right? I swear I'm going to do it this time, okay? I'm going to stop eating the sweets. I'm going to sign this contract. I'm going to hold myself accountable. I'm going to lose the weight this time. I'm going to do it, okay? You know what happens? You have a bad night. You just rip that up. You eat the whole cheesecake. I didn't sign nothing. You don't tell me nothing. Okay, not really useful to have a one-person contract. So when we're talking unilateral, it's one promise. Two parties, at least still. But when we've got these parties, only one has made a promise. Bilateral is two promises. Now let me give you a very trivial or basic example of a unilateral, and then I'll give you the real estate example. If my neighbor's teenager was to walk out and he was mowing his parents' front yard, and I look at him and I say, hey, if you mow my yard later, I'll give you $80. And that was the whole exchange. Folks, that is a unilateral contract. Did that kid promise to mow my yard? No. But did I promise to pay him $80 if he did? That's a unilateral agreement. If you do this, I promise I will do that. One promise is made. And so the most common example of this in real estate is an option to purchase contract. So let's say that I went to Jaleesa and I said, Jaleesa, I think I'd like to buy your house for $600,000. And Jaleesa says, well, I'd be willing to sell it to you for that. So I say, okay, well, Jaleesa, how about this? How about I give you $2,000 to give me 3 weeks to decide if I want to buy it or not. And if I decide to buy it, I will buy it for $600,000. That is called an option to purchase. So that time period that I purchased is called an option period. And understand that I said, let me think about it. So have I promised Jaleesa that I'm going to buy her house? No. But if I decide to buy it, hasn't Jaleesa promised to sell it to me? There you go. If I decide to buy, she has promised to sell it to me for $600,000. She said yes. She said she would sell it. She said she'd give me 3 weeks to decide for that money that I gave her. That is called an option to purchase. So you basically have this option period to decide if you want to buy or not. And if you decide to buy, the seller has promised to sell. So that's why it's a unilateral. There's only one promise. Now, folks, a period of time accompanied by money to decide if you want to buy or not. Does that sound like anything to y'all?
Due diligence.
It sounds just like it, doesn't it? Folks, understand that an option to purchase is a national contract concept, but they're not very common in North Carolina. You know why? Because our offer to purchase in Contract Standard Form 2T, which is a due diligence style contract, works exactly like an option to purchase. Folks, a buyer has purchased a period of time to decide whether they want to move forward with a transaction or not, and they can terminate for any reason or no reason. So due diligence is a very unilateral style concept. It works just like an option to purchase. So when you terminate during a due diligence period, it's called exercising your right to terminate. You have purchased that right. Well, if you go past your due diligence period and a buyer terminates, what do we call that?
Hard. I mean,
Well, there's a word for it.
I forgot what you call
Inventory or
No. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. Okay, you've gone after your due diligence period. They were supposed to buy it and they don't. They terminate. So what do we call that?
breach of contract.
Breach. That's a breach. Folks, let me make the point here. If you terminate during your due diligence period, you're in your right to do that as a buyer. If you terminate after your due diligence period, now you're in breach of contract. Because think about it. Due diligence is that time period to figure out if you want to buy it or not. If you get past your due diligence period, now we are in a bilateral contract. Because now you've made it past due diligence, so the buyer has promised to buy, the seller still promises to sell, which is why a buyer is only in breach after the due diligence period. Does that make sense? So it's unilateral during due diligence. The seller has promised to sell, but the buyer hasn't promised to buy. They said, let me do my research. After due diligence, now we've moved into bilateral. In that same example with the option to purchase, if I told Julissa, hey, Julissa, I've decided to buy. If you exercise your option to purchase, it upgrades to a bilateral agreement. But while you're in your option period or your due diligence period, it's unilateral. Now, most other contracts are bilateral. Folks, we are talking about the fun-filled world of basic contract law and all the different things that a contract can be. And so we've used some of the vocabulary from pre-licensing already. So we left off talking about unilateral versus bilateral, okay? Unilateral is one promise. Bilateral is two promises. Now, the most common form of a unilateral is, as I said, an option to purchase contract. Now, oddly enough, our standard Form 2T in North Carolina is a due diligence style contract, which works almost identical to an option to purchase because it is this unilateral right of the buyer to terminate for any reason or no reason. Notice that word, unilateral right. When you actually are terminating as a buyer, there used to be a form that was called buyer is exercising their unilateral right to terminate. Like that was the name of the form. Now they've kind of changed it to just a general unilateral termination form where you would put your reasoning in there. But of course, as a buyer during your due diligence period, you have purchased that right to terminate for any reason or no reason. Now, most contracts are bilateral. A lot of people get confused on this. So even things like your listing agreements, your buyer agency agreements, they're bilateral. What do you think? Think about it. What are the promises? There's multiple promises on each side. And when we say bilateral, it doesn't mean only two promises, but there's at least a promise, one promise from each party, sometimes multiple. What are, in a nutshell, what are the promises on a listing agreement?
What was that question again, Seth?
What are the promises? I told you most of our agreements are bilateral, like our agency agreements are bilateral. So I said, think about it. What are the promises that are being made on the listing agreement that makes it bilateral?
The promise to sell it or the promise to list it, they're promising to allow you to sell it.
Well, What else do you want aside just being allowed to sell it?
Get paid to do it.
Get paid to do it. There you go. So let's combine that together. The seller promises to pay you for helping them sell their house, and you promise to put forth your best efforts to help them sell their house. So that's bilateral, promise or promise. Buyer agency agreement the same. I promise Mr. and Mrs. Buyer to put forth my best efforts to help you buy real property, and you promise to pay me if I do. So there's bilateral in most of these agreements. And of course, even with our option to purchase and our due diligence period, they become bilateral once you have moved past that due diligence or once you have exercised your option to purchase, because then we're dealing with two sets of promises. So let's keep going. Unilateral versus bilateral. Well, contracts can also be executed versus executory. Now, this is where you may hear some things in the real world that get a little confusing. Let me provide some clarity. Executed under basic contract law means fully performed, completed. And when we're dealing with real estate sales contracts, that means a house has been exchanged for money. That is fully executed, dunsies, as we say. But to execute also means to sign. And so sometimes you have to use context clues to understand what we're talking about. So let me give you the real world example here. If I'm a buyer's agent and I send an offer over to a listing agent, and if that seller accepts my offer, very often the listing agent will send me back an email that says, here is a copy of the fully executed contract. Well, folks, if we just got under contract, have we already closed the deal? No. So what that agent is trying to say is that it has been signed. To execute means to sign. So if you ever have somebody saying, here's a copy of the fully executed contract, they mean, here's a copy signed by all the parties. It's more appropriately an executory contract, but they're not necessarily incorrect. It's just the context differentiation. But under basic contract law, executed means completed, done, finished. So when we've got things left to be completed, but we are under contract, we call that an executory contract. When you are pending, contingent, any of those things, you are in executory status. Yes, we have a contract. No, it's not completed. It's called executory. Still things left to be done. So executed versus executory. Contracts can also be valid, void, and voidable. Now, I know you remember these words because we use them a lot in pre-licensing, both for deeds and for contracts. Do not get confused, though. Right now, we're talking about contracts, not deeds. So let me just start going into some different pieces of this. Valid is where it contains all of the essential elements under basic contract law. There are 4. And I'm going to talk about them some more in just a second. Now, a valid contract, I like to say, is presumably enforceable. There's not a guarantee that it's enforceable, but it is presumably enforceable. A contract that contains all the essential elements under most criteria would probably be enforceable in a court of law, but it's not a guarantee. And I'll give you some more insight in just a second. A void contract is basically like having no contract at all. Okay? Not enforceable on anybody in any way, shape, and form. That's a void contract. And then voidable is potentially enforceable on one party, but the other party could potentially escape their obligations. They could invalidate the contract. That's why we call it voidable. Now, the most common examples of voidable, a minor, or somebody drunk as a skunk, high as a kite. Meaning they didn't have the capacity to make decisions. So a minor doesn't have the ability to contract completely and utterly on their own. And then somebody who was drunk as a skunk, high as a kite was not of sound mind at the time, which would potentially give them the right to back out. A void contract, the most common example, is lacking an essential element, like being for an illegal act, or somebody who has been declared mentally incompetent by a court of law. So I'm going to give you a few examples here, and then I'll expand some more. Back when Britney Spears was in her conservatorship, she had a guardian, her father, because she had been declared mentally incompetent by the courts. If you had the money back when she was in her conservatorship and you approached Britney Spears and offered to pay her $10 million for her mansion, and she agreed and she signed a contract, toss it out. It has no legal standing because she was not of her own affairs. She could not handle her own affairs. Her dad was in charge of those. So somebody who's been declared mentally incompetent, that contract has no legal standing whatsoever. It'd be void. Now, the other example that I gave you is for something like an illegal act. And so I want you to think about this. If I went to Cole and I said, hey, Cole, listen, I'll give you 100 pounds of crystal meth to kill somebody for me. And we drafted it up in writing and we both signed it. Well, folks, that is for something exceptionally illegal. So that would be a void contract. So I want you to picture this. Cole kills somebody for me. He comes to me. He says, Seth, where is my crystal meth? And I look at him and I say, Cole, listen, I'm really sorry to tell you this, Cole. I smoked it all. Okay, all that crystal meth is gone. I don't even know how I'm still alive, Cole. There's a lot of crystal meth to smoke. If Cole went to a court of law to try to enforce it on me, okay, number one is a void contract. It's not enforceable in any way, shape, and form. Number two, the police officer or whoever the judge is, they're going to say, why don't you go talk to this police officer right over here? They'll be happy to take a statement from the other side of those metal bars. So a void contract is one that's not enforceable in any way, shape, or form. Give me 1 second here. So I want you to understand, though, in that scenario where I gave you this illegal thing between Cole and I, right, crystal meth for murder, that's exceptionally illegal. That would be considered a void contract. Folks, do not ever confuse a void contract for a contract that can't be completed. What if Cole killed somebody and I gave him crystal meth? We have completed that void agreement. Void just means not enforceable in a court of law in any way, shape, and form. Okay? Voidable, I told you one party might have the right to get out. So here's the conundrum that people face. When we're dealing, I'm going to skip forward for a second. Let me show you this. Well, I don't have the good slides. So let me just tell you this real quick and I'll show you what I mean. When we're dealing with the essential elements of a valid contract, they're going to show up on another slide in a second, but I want you to understand the four. If you talk to an attorney, the essential elements are more than four, but for real estate, there's four. Okay? The essential elements to have a valid contract is mutual agreement, number one. Every contract is voluntary. You cannot force anybody into a contract, so you have to have this, what we call mutual agreement, voluntary, meeting of the minds, mutual assent, reality of consent. It's got a lot of names, but parties have to agree. That's one. Has to have consideration, something of value. Have to have legally competent parties, once again, 18, sane and sober. And it has to be for a legal act or a legal purpose. If those four elements exist, then we have a valid contract. Now, folks, one of the things I didn't say was in writing. And the reason being, we are talking about basic contract law right now. Folks, do all contracts deal with real estate? No. And so there are plenty of contracts that are enforceable and valid in a court of law, even if they are not in writing. Everybody has problems with that. But this is the honest to goodness truth. There are contracts that are enforceable even though they're not in writing. Go back to the restaurant, folks. That implied agreement that was not in writing was absolutely enforceable if you tried to get up and walk out on your bill. So valid means it contains all the essential elements. Now here's why I said that a valid contract is presumably enforceable, but not guaranteed to be enforceable. If you had a contract, let me just use Dale as an example, okay? I say, Dale, I'd like to buy your house for $800,000. You okay with that, Dale? Dale says yes. Just go ahead. Yep, there you go. Dale, are you at least 18, sane and sober? Yeah, me too, depending on the day, okay? So we've got a house, we've got money, right? We've got consideration, we've got agreement, it's for a legal act, and we've got legally competent parties. Can we all agree that Dale and I just entered into an agreement that contains all 4 essential elements of a valid contract? But here's the problem. In North Carolina, our statute of frauds states that contracts for the sale of real property are not enforceable in a court of law unless they're in writing. And that is why you can have a valid contract that is unenforceable. Contains all the essential elements under basic contract law. But let's say that Dale and I agree for me to buy his house for $800,000. And then on the day of closing, he calls me up. He's like, Seth, I'm at the attorney's office. Where are you at? And I said, oh, Dale, I changed my mind. I'm sorry, I'm not going to buy your house. Well, Dale can't take me to court because here's what's going to happen. He's going to go to Judge Judy and he's going to say, Judge Judy, I want you to tell Seth he has to buy my house. We had an agreement for him to buy my house for $800,000. And Judge Judy's going to say, well, great, Dale, I'm happy to help you. Show me the written agreement. And Dale's going to say, well, what had happened was it was just a verbal agreement and a handshake and we did a high five. And that was it. And they're going to say, I'm sorry, Dale, we can't even hear it in a court of law because it wasn't in writing. Now, yet again, don't confuse an unenforceable contract with a contract that can't be fulfilled. Because if I show up on the day of closing and give Dale money, and Dale signs the deed over to me, didn't we just complete a contract even though it wasn't in writing? The whole point of a contract that we want it to be enforceable so that we could take it to court if you didn't perform what you were supposed to do. So a valid... Go ahead.
This goes back to, in North Carolina, we cannot have implied contracts. That's the point you're driving home.
Well, in North Carolina, let me expand on that for a second. The agency contracts, the agency agreements, they don't actually fall under the North Carolina statute of frauds. However, we have license laws and commission rules in North Carolina that says we can't operate under implied agreements. So in North Carolina, when we're dealing with contracts for the sale of real property, statute of frauds says they have to be in writing. When we're dealing with agency contracts in North Carolina, real estate commission rule says they have to be in writing. But at the end of the day, yeah, I mean, we've got multiple sets of laws that say that we can't operate under implied anything in real estate in North Carolina. So a valid contract that contains all the 4 essential elements under basic contract law could potentially be enforceable because it's valid under basic contract law and was not required to be in writing. Could potentially be voidable if one party had the ability to get out, depending on the circumstances, even though it contained all those essential elements. And we'll talk about some more examples in a second. Or it could be completely unenforceable, even though it contains those essential elements because it wasn't in writing or something like that, which would make it lack enforceability under certain doctrines or statutes like the statute of fraud. Now, I told you a void contract is like having no contract at all, not enforceable on either party. And so if you actually read the verbiage under the statute of frauds in North Carolina, it says contracts for the sale of real property shall be void if not in writing. Well, void means not enforceable on anybody. So, now, let me give you some deeper dive into the differentiation between void and voidable. Okay, I told you void would be for an illegal act, like the crystal meth and murder. Somebody who's been declared mentally incompetent by a court of law, whether it be like Britney Spears going a little cuckoo, or maybe a parent or family member having dementia, Alzheimer's or something like that. That could end up making it where it would be a void contract. So let's say that you had your mother or great-grandmother and you tried to convince them to convey property to you. It wouldn't have any legal standing if they were not of sound mind. Now, I told you a void contract can still be completed, but doesn't have any enforceability in a court of law. Now, I want to talk about voidable for a second. I told you a minor would be considered voidable. If a minor was to sign a contract to buy or sign a contract to sell, that minor could potentially get out of it. But let's talk about the other one, which is more common. Drunk as a skunk, high as a kite. If you are not of sound mind at the time you sign the contract, it is potentially voidable. It is never void, and let me explain why. Let me go back to this where it says voidable. Okay, under the influence at the time of the contract. I want you to picture that you had a client who was sitting by the pool on a Saturday, sipping some Mai Tais, scrolling on Zillow. And while they're scrolling on Zillow, they find their dream home and they text you and they say, "Oh my God, I'm sitting by the pool. I just found this house. I love it. Can we go see it today?" You say, "Sure." And they leave the pool, they get ready, they come meet you. They've had a couple Mai Tais. They love the house. They want to put an offer in. They put an offer in and it gets accepted. Folks, are they probably lucid enough to make the decision to buy a house after a Mai Tai or two? Most likely. So we would not want to invalidate their whole contract based on this presumption that they had a drink or two. But let me tell you why it's voidable. There are two types of people in this world. The people who can handle their liquor and the people who cannot. If you didn't know this. And let me prove a point to you. Have any of you ever had a night where you went out and you woke up the next morning and you said, "I did what? Are you for real? I don't remember any of that." Anybody ever had those nights? It's okay if you haven't, but I'm just saying, a lot of people have. So here's the thing, folks. It is very possible for one person to have 3 drinks and be blackout and drunk and remember nothing. It is very possible for another person to have 3 drinks and be completely aware of their decisions. So we would never automatically invalidate a contract based on the fact that you had some drinks. But because of the point that is, some people are not aware of their decision making at the time that they are inebriated, you could potentially be voidable. So if please understand too that this is not just like an automatic out. You bear the burden of proof, right? I want you to think about this. Sam and I are hanging out at the bar and we are drinking, okay? We're taking shot after shot after shot and we are getting white girl wasted. No offense, white girls, it's just a saying, okay? We get wasted and in the midst of it, I'm like, "Sam, you're a good friend. You're a good friend, Sam. I'm going to sell my house to you for $5 because you're such a good friend." And I write it out on a napkin and Sam signs this contract on the napkin. And I wake up the next morning and there's like a text message from Sam at like 3 o'clock in the morning. It says, "Man, you're such a good friend to sell me your house for $5. I'm like, "I did what?" And I pick up the phone and I call Sam and I said, "Sam, dog, I was wasted, man. You know I'm not selling you my house for $5. And if Sam is insistent that I am, this is where we could go to court and I could show my bar tab to the judge, have the witness testimony from the bartender that said, "Yeah, these guys were talking about buying and selling houses," and he couldn't even spell his name. I had to write it on that napkin for him. And if I can prove that I was not of sound mind, the judge is going to let me out of that contract. Okay, that's voidable. Does that make sense? But it's not an automatic out. Let me give you an example of this, okay? I don't want you to think that you can just start getting out of every contract by saying, "I was drunk." All right? So like tomorrow you like go to your gym. You're like, "I'd like to cancel my 3-year gym membership because I was drunk when I signed this contract." And they're like, "Ma'am, you came in at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. How are you drunk?" You don't tell me how to live my life. I was drunk at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. I want out, right? They're not going to let you out on that. Right, Dale? You don't let anybody out just because they say they were drunk at 7 a.m. Yeah, you see what I'm saying? Of course they signed that contract while they were lucid. So you would bear the burden of proof that you were not of sound mind at the time. It's not just an automatic out. We're like, "I'm terminating my phone contract. I was drunk when I signed up for Verizon." It doesn't work that way. You do have to prove it. So as we continue on, let's talk about some other verbiage that comes into play here. Okay, we've got an addendum versus an amendment. Now, the plural of the word addendum is addenda. All right, and so in some states, they look at these very similarly. In North Carolina, we have a very specific outlook. Lucky for you, you are all real estate brokers in North Carolina, so I can teach you exactly how to look at this in North Carolina. In North Carolina, an addendum, the plural of which, as I just said, is addenda, is, as the three first letters suggest, an add-on to an offer that will become part of the initial contract. So we have these standardized forms that sometimes don't outline absolutely everything we need them to. And so you would add an addendum to cover more details. We have a lot of standardized ones that we use in North Carolina. The FHA-VA financing addendum, the signature addendum that Phil and I were talking about a little bit ago, the vacation rental addendum, the short sale addendum, okay? A lot. And so these are designed to be added on to the initial offer to purchase, and they will become part of the contract. Now, an amendment, you've heard the word amendment before, or to amend. An amendment is a change to a legal instrument. That's what an amendment is. Like the amendment to the Constitution, the amendment to the Residential Property Disclosure Act, the amendment to the Fair Housing Act, a change to a legal thing. Contracts included. If you want to change here's a term, executory contract, meaning one that's already in place, you would need an amendment to do that in North Carolina. That is how we change it. And we have standardized forms for that, and there's other things that are not called amendments, but they basically are one. So if we're under contract, and I said I was going to buy your house for $400,000, and we agree that now it's going to be $395,000. We would amend that executory contract. Okay, to change. An addenda is an add-on to the initial offer as part of contract formation.
Is it the same thing as an attachment?
It is, but we don't really call it that from a contractual point of view, just because it has to be formally added into by way of like, the little check boxes down at the bottom where it says supplemental documentation.
So my buyer's agent agreement, we reference 6 parcels of land, and we put that in an attachment, but it's really an addenda.
Yeah, and so this is where we kind of get into a little more of the nuanced terminology. What you could also call that is an exhibit. So sometimes you have to put an exhibit in there and say, see exhibit A, see exhibit B, see, reference document. So yeah, an attachment or an exhibit could just be a piece of clarity, not necessarily doing something specific, but just a reference point. So those are typically called attachments or exhibits, whereas an addendum is more of a specifically structured document, but very similar concept.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to look at the different addenda and amendments that we have as standardized forms in the very near future. So here's where we get into the essential elements. Now, on this piece of paper, it says 5. Well, it says 5 because we are dealing with a real estate class, but please understand that the first 4 are only the ones recognized under basic contract law. So I told you the 4 essential elements of a valid contract under basic contract law: mutual agreement, consideration, legal capacity of the parties, 18 sane and sober, and for a lawful objective, or in other words, for a legal act. So there's a lot of different ways that we articulate these. Now, the one that has the most names is the first one. I told you, mutual agreement, mutual assent, mutuality of assent, reality of consent. They call it a lot of names. Ultimately, it is a meeting of the minds. Every contract is voluntary. Because if I went up to Caroline and I said, Caroline, I'll give you $2 for your house. Folks, Caroline and I don't have a contract, do we? What is that called?
Unilateral.
Well, that's not even there, right? Because then it's not even a contract. It was just an offer.
Right.
It's a very bad offer at that. She's going to be like, no, thank you. So an offer is where it starts, and you can't force anybody to take this offer. So ultimately it comes down to, have we agreed? And so we've got to have this mutual agreement. So every contract is voluntary. So this is where we're going to start, is with this mutual assent, mutuality of assent, reality of consent, a lot of different places. So we're going to go through all of these, okay? Now, in writing, I told you is on here because we are dealing with real estate contracts, and our statute of frauds says that contracts for the sale of real property have to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. Other things listed on our statute of frauds, we'll talk about in a minute: promissory notes, deeds, contracts for the sale of real property, leases in excess of 3 years, restrictive covenants, easements, just to name a few. So here's where we get into some really important stuff, okay? I told you, when we're dealing with contract formation, it always starts as an offer, okay? Here's what I'd like. I hope you like it too. And so when you make that offer, right, we've got the offer or making the offer, and we got the offeree receiving it. In order for a contract to be formed, a couple big steps have to happen. They have to accept your offer with no changes, and then they have to communicate it back to the offeror or the offeror's agent. And we're going to talk about the communication piece more in just a second. But we make an offer. If they choose to accept it, they can, and then they communicate it back. And of course, it has to have all the other essential elements. Now, this right here says not illusionary, or illusory is the other way to say it, which basically means lacking consideration. Let me give you an example of this. I don't know if any of you are following cryptocurrency right now, but there are several different ones out there, and one of them is Shiba Inu, and it has a very, 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 very small exchange rate. So if I was to offer you to buy your house for 100 million Shiba Inu, okay, that sounds like I'm paying you a lot of money. That's like $7.50. If I'm being completely honest, it's like $7. It's like $3.50, okay? It is not a lot of money. And so we cannot try to trick you into entering a contract by making it sound like we're giving you something of value when we're not. That would be what we call illusory or illusionary, lacking consideration. So there has to be actual consideration. Not too specific on the amount, but of course you could go to court if there, as long as there's some consideration, we can go to court and try to enforce it. You may or may not win. So we've got the offer as the starting point. Now, I told you, when we're dealing with offers, I want you to think about this in a very old school way, because it helps you keep this straight, if you will. So here's what I mean. When we draft up an offer, we're going to take our form and we're going to put terms on there, right? I want to buy your house for $400,000. I want to close on March 25th of 2024. I'm going to offer you, $1,000 in due diligence money. I want you to pay $2,000 in seller paid closing costs. You're going to put all these terms on there, and you're going to send it over. And so the way that we can actually form a contract is accepting it with no changes. So when an offeror sends an offer, it is already signed and dated, okay? And the reason is, what we're basically saying as the offeror, hey, I like all this stuff, so I've already signed it. It's my hope that you also like it, and so that you will also sign it as written and communicate it back. So an acceptance is bound by the exact terms, no change. If you make any change, that is a counteroffer. And a counteroffer is a rejection. So let me tell you how to think about a counteroffer for the sake of this class. If you were to send an offer over like this, and the seller liked everything except for maybe the due diligence, they wanted $2,000. They would also sign it and date it, but then what they would do is they would put a strike through on due diligence, they would change it, and then they would initial and date that change. So now when they send it back, the roles have switched. The seller is now the offeror, the buyer is now the offeree, and now the buyer, the offeree, has to decide, are they okay with this change or not? And if they are and they want to accept it, they would also initial, date it, and communicate it back to the offeror. A counteroffer should be thought of as something that can be accepted. Now, the reason why that's important for this class is to understand how a counteroffer actually works. In the real world, folks, we're not very often sending formal counteroffers, but you need to think about it this way for the class. What happens in the real world typically? The offer gets sent, and then it's rejected, and then we go into verbal negotiations, and then somebody will draft up the final copy. But that's not a formal counteroffer. That's just what we call verbal negotiations or email negotiations. But for all intents and purposes, a counteroffer should be thought of as something that can be accepted by the opposite party. Everybody still with me so far? So the other thing that I need you to understand is from an offer point of view, offers should be thought of as, I always say living, breathing things, but let me just call it flowers, folks, because the thing is, offers can be killed. And if I start talking about bunnies, it starts sounding really morbid and dark really quick. So let's talk about flowers, okay? In that example where I said, I'm going to offer Caroline $2 for her house, I want you to think about it as one piddly little dandelion that I plucked out of my yard. And I said, here you go. This is for you. Now, if she wants to, she can put it in water and hold on to it and keep it alive for a little bit of time. But because that dandelion, the $2 offer, was so offensive, here's what Caroline did instead. She took it, she threw it on the ground, and she stomped on it, and she twisted her foot. Folks, can Caroline bring that dandelion back to life? No. So that's where you got to think of offers like something living like flowers. If you kill it, it is dead. You cannot bring it back to life. Here's the point. If later Caroline changes her mind and says, okay, Seth, I'll accept your $2 offer, which she wouldn't. But if she did, she can't accept it anymore because she killed it. She rejected it. You can't bring it back to life. Now, could she send me a dandelion back, another $2 offer, and say, would you accept this again? Sure. Could she ask me to send my offer to her again? Sure. Sometimes it's hard for us to grasp because we send the physical document over. Yeah, they still have the physical document, but the right to accept it dies when you reject it. And a counteroffer is also a rejection because what you're saying is no, but. So it's a rejection. So if Caroline says no to $2 but $500,000, she's killed my offer. So rejection and then a new offer is made. That is how a counteroffer works. You cannot go back and try to accept the original offer, no matter how much you want to, unless all parties agree that it's okay. But it's not something you can do automatically. Everybody still okay with this? Now, the reason this is so important is that timing piece. The second you get under contract, due diligence money is due. So you've got to know, is my offer alive and well? Has it been killed? Has it been accepted? Have we moved to a contract? Where are we at? Now, the most important piece of an offer moving into a contract, bar none, is communication, folks. If I send an offer to Ertley for $800,000 to buy his house, and Ertley's at his house and I'm at mine and we're not sitting in Zoom like we are currently, and Ertley signs the contract, is there any way for me to know that if he signed it in person where he lives? No. Can we all agree that there's nothing stopping Ertley from just shredding it up and pretending like it never happened? So signature is indicative of acceptance, but it's not actually acceptance. We do not have a contract until that acceptance has been communicated. And that communication always happens to the offeror or the offeror's agent. I'm going to say that again. Communication always happens to the offeror or the offeror's agent. Never happens to the offeree. Now, that communication, folks, this is where it might bother you a little bit, but you got to understand this. That communication can happen basically any way. It can happen by word of mouth, in person or on the phone. It can happen by email, snail mail, telegraph, fax, hell, probably smoke signals or carrier pigeons. If we're being completely honest, you could do it just about any single way. If they know that you have accepted it, if you have communicated that to the offeror or the offeror's agent, we are under contract. Now we're going to talk about it in a little bit. The reason why all these digital forms of communication are okay is because of what we call the UETA, the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. 2024 is a time to be alive. No, you do not have to sign with an ink pen on most things anymore. Digital communications, digital signatures are legally binding because of the UETA. Now here's the one thing that drives everybody nuts, okay? The mailbox rule. The mailbox rule is a very antiquated, outdated rule, but it's still technically alive. So let me give you an example of the mailbox rule in action in the real world, and then I'll translate it to real estate. Once upon a time, folks, the post offices stayed open until midnight on April 15th. Why? So that you could get your tax return dropped in the mailbox and it can be postmarked by April 15th. Because in the eyes of the government, as long as it was postmarked on that day, it was done on time. And that exists in a lot of government aspects. I'll give you a funny story about this before I give you the real estate world side of it. Some of you have been in my classes before know I have a house in Georgia and have 82 acres down there. Well, when I purchased it, it fell out of a conservation program, and so my taxes went up. So I had to reapply for a conservation program, which allowed my taxes to be lower. And so the tax deadline for like getting that conservation, application in was fast approaching. I was trying to overnight it and FedEx wasn't going to get it there on time. So I hopped in my car, drove down to deliver it to these people and just spent the weekend at my house in Georgia because I did not want to lose. It's like $1,000 a year savings on these taxes. So I drove down there to deliver it. And I told the people at the tax office my funny story about how I wasn't going to get there on time. She's like, if it was postmarked by that time, we would have discounted it. I was like, ugh. As a real estate instructor, I should have known that. I didn't bother to call and ask. So I looked like an idiot. So it still exists that they have this understanding that, okay, if it's postmarked by a certain date and time. Now, here's where it comes into real estate. From a real estate point of view, when you are communicating acceptance of an offer, if you mail that communication to the offeror or the offeror's agent, it is considered under contract or communicated at the time it is in the possession of the United States Postal Service. Now, we all realize that means the offeror hasn't seen it yet. Doesn't matter. Legally, you're under contract, which is why, from a testable point of view, from an understanding point of view, know that this exists. From a real world point of view, folks, don't you ever use the mailbox rule. There is no reason for it in 2024. It's okay if you want to mail something, but don't let that be the only way that you're communicating with somebody. So at the time it's in the possession of the United States Postal Service, it's technically communicated. It's very hard to prove that. The only thing you can prove is that postmark date. But it has been communicated. As soon as you drop it in the mailbox, it's communicated. Very silly rule, but it does happen.
Seth, the contract that I got my client under, it was interesting. So we agreed verbally after a couple of exchanges on January 30th. Now that was important in my client's mind because she's looking out to August. Okay, August 30th. And so the due diligence money is being placed with a title insurance company. And it says in the contract that the title insurance company, once they have everything, your W-9 and all that, then they will notify you that, everything's a contract. So I was sitting there thinking, I wanted it to be January 30, but we really didn't get it all finalized till February 7th. But they left it dated January 30 because we had a verbal agreement that she agreed to sell it and they agreed to buy it. So that's what drives that home for me. So.
Yeah, and now here's the weird thing. Because of this communication being so important, let's talk about it like the multiple listing service, MLS. It asks for a contract date. So let's say that, I send an offer over to who I've not picked on yet. Let me circle back around to Phil. Okay, so let's say that I send you an offer, Phil, and your seller client sit on it for a week. and then communicate, like sign it and communicate it back a week later. The date on that offer that I sent was today. Even though, that was the date that's on the contract, we weren't under contract until a week later when you communicated it. And so a lot of people put it in the MLS wrong because it's not the date that was written out on the contract. It's the date that it was communicated. Now, as long as all parties agree that it is what it is, then it's fine. But sometimes the reason that comes into play on, was it actually this date is because maybe a contract has like a certain day count to terminate. Well, you have 20 days to terminate from the effective date. Well, okay, now we really need to make sure we're all on the same page. What was the effective date? Was it the date that, you communicated? Was it the day that, was on the date written in the date line? So it's very important. But technically, communication is the qualifier, right?
Right.
Now, we're going to give you some more examples of this. Please understand that, this is true in general under basic contract law. Any and all forms of communication are acceptable. However, it is possible to specify the specific manner in which you wish to receive that communication, because sometimes it makes more sense than others. I'm going to be honest with you, folks. I don't want you faxing me my response back. I don't even got a fax machine. It's not going anywhere. All right. So sometimes we specify, and we're going to talk more about that down the road. But any type of communication is acceptable. Now, folks, I want you to understand something. Even if you haven't seen the communication, it's still communicated. So let's say you email the response where you're accepting it to the offeror or the offeror's agent. Even though they haven't looked at their email, it's time-stamped. You're under contract. If you leave a voicemail, even though they haven't listened to it, it's time-stamped. You're under contract. Text message, time-stamped, under contract. It's not whether or not they've seen it. It's whether or not it's been sent. Very important. Now,
I see you have their email, mail, telegraph, and fax are all okay. I'm sorry, what is telegraph?
yeah, old school.
Old school.
The precursor to the cell phone or the telephone. It was the tappy thing. Like the Alexander Graham Bell or whoever it was that you would hit the. Who was it early? Do you know who? You shook your head. Who invented it? The telegraph. Do you know?
I was thinking Graham Bell too, but I was just thinking. You never watched the Western where they had to send a telegraph?
Yeah.
Western?
Yeah, the old school Western. It's a little machine that's got this little clicky thing, and you would basically hit it using Morse code. Yep. And it would go to the other side. So and it was a way of communicating with just noises before we could actually do voice communication. So the point that it's making, not that any of us would even have or be able to use a telegraph or even a fax machine nowadays, this kind of goes back to the carrier pigeon. Basically, every form of communication could arguably be acceptable. But don't attempt to use the telegraph, Steve. I don't think anybody has a receiving line for that, right? Yeah. So here's where I want to point out some clarity here, okay? The communication always goes to the offeror or the offeror's agent. So I'm going to walk you through a multifaceted learning lesson is what I like to call it. So let's say that Jaleesa calls me up and she says, Seth, I found you online. I'd like to buy a house. I say, great, Jaleesa. I'd love to help you. So I meet Jaleesa at this house. Folks, what is the first thing I'm going to go over with Jaleesa?
Working with real estate agents.
The working with real estate agents disclosure. And we talk a lot more about that in 301, okay, in agency and disclosures. But so we're going to go over the working with real estate agents disclosure, which is a menu of options. I'm going to say, Jaleesa, let me explain how agency works. There are agents who can represent you as a buyer. There is dual agency, which is where a firm can represent a buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Of that, there's designated dual agency, which is where the firm represents both. They will designate a specific licensee to represent the buyer and a specific licensee to represent the seller. So it acts like exclusive representation, even though it's dual. And then understand, Jaleesa, you can be unrepresented. You do not have to have an agent as a buyer. So now that I've gone over that, I ask her to sign it. Folks, what's the second step after asking her or giving her the working with real estate agents disclosure?
Agency agreement.
Agency agreement. I'm going to look at Jaleesa. I'm going to say, Jaleesa, I'd love to be your buyer's agent. Can I represent you? Now, of course, we know that buyer agency agreements can be in writing from the offset, or they can be oral to start, but they still are express stated, even though they're oral. So I'm going to look at Jaleesa. I'm going to say, Jaleesa, I'd love to be your buyer's agent. Understand that we could start off with a written agreement or an oral buyer agency agreement. How does that sound? Can I represent you as your buyer agent? And here's what Jaleesa says. You ready for this? Jaleesa says, oral agreement, written agreement. Okay. How about this, Seth? I watch a lot of Selling Sunset and HGTV. I don't think I need an agent. Just show me the pretty house. So she doesn't want to hire me. Folks, can I show her the pretty house?
Yes.
Sure I can. So here's what happens. I showed Jaleesa the pretty house. She loves it, and she wants to put an offer in, okay? So can I put in an offer for Jaleesa?
Not without it.
No.
Well, yeah, you could. Yes. Yes.
The answer is yes. Now, I'll give you some more clarity on this in a second. So the answer is yes, okay? So I write up an offer for Jaleesa for whatever she wants, $400,000, okay? And this goes over to Sam, who's the listing agent. And then Sam sends it to his seller, Cole. Cole signs it and accepts this offer that we got for Jaleesa. When Cole signs it, are we under contract?
No.
No, Cole's the seller, so it's not enough for him to just sign it. We don't know that yet, okay? So no, Cole signing it, not a contract yet, because communication's key. So Cole then sends that signed offer back to Sam. Are we under contract?
Yes.
Yes.
Good catch, Terry. No, because it is, Cole is the offeree. It is the offeree's agent that knows. Remember, communication has to go to the offeror or the offeror's agent. It's Jaleesa's offer, right? So she's the offeror. It's got to make it back to that side. Now, folks, here's the thing. Sam takes that and he sends it back to me, who I wrote the offer. Are we under contract now?
You're not the offeror. You just wrote the contract for the offeror. No.
The answer is still no, because Jaleesa refused to hire me. And so when I wrote an offer on behalf of Jaleesa, it was as a seller subagent. If I'm a seller subagent, my loyalties are with the seller. I am on this side. So that's special emphasis on the offeror or the offeror's agent. Jaleesa does not have an agent. So now let me add one more thing in. I communicate that acceptance directly to Jaleesa. Are we under contract now?
Yes.
Yes.
Now we're under contract. Very important. The offeror or the offeror's agent. If they don't have an agent, then this can't happen. It would have to go to them directly.
So let me ask you a quick question.
Sure.
Let's say you don't, MLS today, they're not offering you anything, right? The listing agent is not offering you anything to sell it for.
To be a seller subagent.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And so can she say, look, I didn't hire him. I didn't contract with Seth to be my buyer's agent, but he doesn't need to work for free. I want you to pay him X amount. Can you do that?
No, because remember, North Carolina, you have to represent somebody. So you're either representing the buyer or the seller or both. And so if the seller has not acknowledged or agreed to work with seller subagents, then they're not going to compensate you. So you can't just be paid without having representation. So you would actually have to ask them to allow you to represent the seller as well. They're not going to allow that, though. They're going to basically stick to their guns. And they're going to say, no, we're not working with seller subagents. So you're either representing Jaleesa or you're not in this.
But if I've got an email where they've agreed to do that and they've agreed to pay me X%, then that's expressed, stated. then I'll be due. I don't have a written agreement as a subagent.
Here's the problem. In North Carolina, you are not entitled to any compensation without a written agency agreement ultimately. You have to have a person you're representing. If you're not representing the buyer or you're not representing the seller, then you're not entitled to compensation in North Carolina. We do not allow you to just be a freelance middleman. You have to have somebody you represent. So it's either acting as a seller subagent through authority through the seller or the listing firm, or you are acting as a buyer's agent through a written buyer agency agreement with a buyer.
Yeah, so, but it's not in writing from the listing agent. It's saying, yes, we will pay you 3%.
So let me just put it another way. You would not need it in writing yourself, but what would happen is on the listing agreement between the listing firm and the seller, they would have authorized, yes, we're going to work with and cooperate with and compensate seller subagents, or we wouldn't. So unless their listing agreement says that they have, then you can't be one. But if they have a listing agreement, it's okay that you don't have the agreement for representing them as a seller subagent as long as they have authorized you to work as such.
Okay, so they have authorized them, and let's say that publicly it states that they would pay 2.5%, but they're paying me 3%. Can they do that?
Yeah.
Okay, very good.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So this communication is critical, okay? Now, this is one of those interesting things where we have an agency relationship. We do stand in the shoes of our client. So let's just paint a picture here. Let's go back to that scenario. And let's say that Jaleesa did hire me. So I am Jaleesa's buyer's agent. Don't judge my handwriting because, it sucks with this. It sucks normally, but writing with a mouse and a pen, okay, it's just exponentially worse, and I apologize. I should have been a doctor. My handwriting is so bad, but here I am teaching real estate classes. What can you do? All right. So we had Sam and Cole, and then Sam was the listing agent. Well, let's say now I'm representing Jaleesa. I send the offer over. Sam sends it to Cole. Cole signs it. Cole sends it back to Sam, and then Sam sends it back to me. Now that there is this relationship, I am her agent. Now we're under contract the second I know. Now I want you to picture this. What if I'm at Cancun that week with my friends or my family, okay? And I'm not checking my email. Folks, we're still under contract. So a week later, poor Jaleesa's under contract and she has no idea. So I get back from Cancun. She's like, Seth, have we really not heard back from these people yet? God, I'm about to move to a different house. I'm so mad that they haven't responded. I'm going to be like, well, what happened was, Jaleesa, they emailed me 4 days ago. I just suck and I never told you. You've been under contract for 5 days. It's enough for us to know to be under contract, even if our clients don't know yet. Very important to understand. So it's very important for us to communicate it immediately. Imagine if this happened, and after 2 days of me being notified, Jaleesa comes to me. She says, Seth, I'm tired of waiting. I want to terminate. I found another house I like better. I have to look at her and say, Jaleesa, I'm sorry, you can't terminate. You've been under contract for 2 days. I just didn't tell you. And now I look like a jackwagon, don't I? In this regard, communication to the agent is the same as communication to the principal for communication of acceptance only, okay? Not for all things, but in this particular instance, communication of acceptance, you can tell the agent and then we are under contract. Now let me throw a couple other questions into the mix here while we're learning about this mutual assent or this mutual agreement piece, okay? Let's talk about multiple offers. How do we handle multiple offers?
Depends on what the seller wants.
Depends on what the seller wants. What else?
We have to present all the offers.
Yeah. We in North Carolina have what we call the delivery of instruments rule, where we have to deliver all items immediately, but in no case later than 3 days. Now, if you recall that when we're working with buyers and sellers, we are acting as a special agent. We talk more about that in post-licensing 301 as well, but that means we are an advisor. We cannot make decisions on behalf of them. So when we deliver these multiples, we deliver them immediately and in no particular order. We do not deliver them by saying, here's the best, here's the second best, here's the third best. Because if we do that, we've made a decision. We're not allowed to make decisions. We also don't deliver them by saying, here's the first that came in, here's the second, here's the third. Why? Because we don't care. We're not trying to play favoritism or give weight to any of them. You deliver them immediately in no particular order. Yes, then we will review them with our clients and help them decide which is the best for them. But we cannot preemptively or proactively send them to them that way. Everybody good with that statement? Send them all, no particular order, then help them decide on which is the best for them. Well, here's the second piece. Can/must a seller's agent disclose the existence of other offers?
No.
The existence, yes, they just can't give them any numbers.
Yeah.
Right.
There you go. It is okay with the seller's permission to disclose the existence of other offers. But as Jaleesa said, we cannot share the material terms of the offers, at least not without permission of the offeror, which we'll talk more about that. Doesn't really happen. Now, you would not automatically disclose the existence of multiple offers. Can you imagine, folks, there might be a time where disclosing that multiple offers are present may not be in the best interest of the seller. What do you think? Would there be a time that you think that'd be true?
Absolutely. Yep. Yes, sir.
So
You have to disclose
It may prevent other people from
all
doing offers.
offers, good or bad it is.
I've got a real example right there in Raleigh. My little girl, this guy had made, it's back when people were paying way above the ask price. This guy missed out on 2 houses. He moved here from the West Coast, going to work with Apple. And my daughter put her house on the market for $424, and sold it for $491. He was the first offer. 2 other offers came in that day, and then there were 4 lined up to come and see it and make offers the next day. I told her she needed to go ahead and take that first offer and be done with it. It was a cash offer, and due diligence was waived. So, yes.
yeah. So, and let me give you another example of that, because, as y'all said, Terry mentioned it could spook other people. Well, folks, yeah, in Phil's example, there was this crazy market where there was all these multiple offer situations. Sometimes the first offer that comes in is the best, sometimes it's not. But before that crazy market, it was not uncommon for a good house to hit the market and for a buyer to send over a really good offer. And basically it would be accompanied with this verbiage that said something like, hey, listen, this is our best and final because we are not trying to go into a multiple offer situation. So you either accept it or we will move on. Because if you are wanting to go into multiples, we're walking. Well, imagine that you get an offer like that and you've got 6 offers already. You're not going to tell that person you've got 6 offers already, especially when theirs is winning, and they're going to walk if they know that they have multiples. So could you disclose that you have multiple offers? Yes. With the seller's permission, if it's in the seller's best interest. But you would never disclose material terms of the offer, as y'all told me, because there is a rule prohibiting that. That's called shopping offers. The only way that you can disclose terms of an offer is with the offeror's permission. And I want you to picture how stupid that sounds. Can you imagine being a buyer's agent and the listing agent calls you and say, hey, listen, just want to let you know you're currently winning. You've got the best offer. However, my sellers would like to screw you over and would like to screw over all the other buyers. So would you give us permission to tell them how much you offered us so that we can make them pay us more and proxy and by return make you pay us more so we can make the most money? Hello? Hello? Must have got disconnected. Folks are going to hang up on you. Nobody's going to give you permission to screw them over. So is it legal if you have permission? Yes. Is there ever going to be a time when you actually have permission? No. Who in their right mind would give you that permission? I'll never forget it. A couple years ago, I was teaching this, and we as educators, we have like Facebook groups for educators. And I'll never forget it. Somebody found it on the MLS. There was a listing, and in the agent remarks it said, sellers currently have an offer for this amount, with seller's permission, we're sharing it, trying to see if anybody's willing to offer more. And we all started screenshotting this and sharing it with each other. And we were talking crap about it. And we're like, oh my God, what an idiot this person is. And so I guess because I knew of the agent. We're not friends, but I know of him who posted this. And I'm sure somebody went back to him and said, hey, listen, you can't do that. And so then he went in and he changed the agent remarks to with seller and buyer's permission. I'd be like, no, the hell you don't. Ain't no buyer in their right mind that would have offered you that and said, it's okay to share this with the rest of the world so somebody will pay you more. Get out of here. I still have that screenshot somewhere, folks. Nobody's going to agree to that. Bless. So let me ask you another question here. Unless y'all got a question. Everybody still feeling good about everything we've said thus far? So has anybody in here ever utilized or are you familiar with the 340T? It's called the Response to Buyer's Offer Form. Everybody familiar? Kind of, sort of. Never used it, but you've heard of it. Let me give you some insight here, folks. It is a very specific document, and it has 3 very specific uses. We will look at it later when we look at all the forms, but I'll go ahead and tell you the basic uses. It is a formal document that does 3 things and 3 things only. One of them is a rejection with a wish list. So this was kind of popular back in those crazy offer periods of time where you could reject somebody's offer and then you could turn around and say, well, we've rejected your offer, but if you send another offer with this, and this, we would consider it more favorable. So a rejection with a wish list. What were they asking for back in the day? Give us $80,000 in due diligence and offer us $80,000 more and buy me a boat and get my daughter a pony and pay my son's college tuition, and we will consider your offer more favorable. So it can do a rejection with a wish list. It can do a formal call for best and final. We will consider your offer and all other offers up to this date and time. Please submit your final offer before then for us to consider. And then the last one is just a very polite way of saying get bent. It is just an outright rejection. It says, thank you so much, but no thank you. And so that means we have not even given you suggestions. We're not counter-offering you. It's just a rejection, meaning you're so far off that we didn't even feel bothered or inclined to, give you a counter-offer, okay? So those are the 3 things it can do. A rejection with a wish list, a outright rejection, or a formal call for best and final. Is this required to reject somebody's offer? Absolutely not. But it is a way to do it. So, let's take this step further. I've already kind of given you some insight here. When we're dealing with the meeting of the minds, okay? The offer, acceptance, rejection, counteroffer, all these come into play. But here's where we have to have a very specific conversation. I told you, offers are very easy to kill. Contracts, not so much. And so right now we're talking about different ways you can kill an offer. And so let's start with the first one. Okay, you can revoke the offer. Well, you can revoke it any time prior to unconditional acceptance. So the offeror sends an offer. They have not gotten a response back yet. They can kill it. All they have to say is, I take my offer back. It is, there's a form for it, but you really can just email somebody over and say, it's no longer on the table. That's all it takes. We have moved on. Our offer is no longer on the table. That's killing the offer. You can do that anytime prior to unconditional acceptance. Well, we said a rejection is, of course, a killing the offer. You reject it or you counter. Those are both rejections. One is just a rejection that kills it. One is a rejection, then you change the rules and send a new offer. But I told you the offer dies. You cannot bring it back to life. Okay, it's like those flowers. You kill it, they're dead. Lapse of time if specified in the offer. Well, folks, how would you put a specific period of time in an offer that it could be accepted?
You give them 30 days to to accept it.
Well,
Any number of days.
any number of days, but how specifically would you do it?
Isn't there a line on the offer to purchase?
There's not on the offer to purchase standard form 2T in of
Additional
its.
addendum?
There you go.
Yeah.
The additional provisions addendum gives you the opportunity to put an expiration of offer. So folks, basically think of it like those Mission Impossible sunglasses that Tom Cruise used to get, right? They would give him the sunglasses and it would say, your mission if you choose to accept it. And it would go through that whole thing. And once it told him his mission, it says, this glasses will self-destruct in 30 seconds. And he'd have to like take them off his face and throw them in the air and then they'd blow up in the air. It's basically a much less cool version of that. It is a self-destruct sequence. If you do not accept this by this date and time, it dies. So what that basically is a way to make sure that it dies if you haven't gotten a response. You would not need to turn around and revoke it. So let's say that you gave them 3 days. 3 days transpired. They didn't accept your offer. It's dead. It can no longer be accepted anymore. Now, let me help you out with something, folks. How long, let's say that you gave them 3 days to respond. How long do you think you would have to wait before you could revoke that offer as the offeror?
Is it 5 o'clock on the last day?
No.
I think you can do it any time after you submit it.
Anytime. Don't get it confused. Just because you gave them 3 days doesn't mean that you have to wait 3 days before you can revoke it. Look at number 1. You can revoke it anytime prior to unconditional acceptance. All you're saying is it will self-destruct in 3 days, but you as the offeror always have the right to take it back anytime prior to unconditional acceptance. If you give them 3 weeks, you could still revoke it in 30 seconds after sending it. Never going to mess that up.
In mine, they gave the lady 30 days, but they said we could not continue to market it. That was interesting. We had to deal with them in good faith until we told them, yes, we'll take your offer we want.
I mean, I suppose in theory you can put just about anything you want in there, but some people are not going to go for it. I mean, you just sound silly with some of those provisions, right?
Right.
Yes, Seth, we had one over the weekend. I'm again still new to this, but in new construction where somebody had submitted an offer on a home we have in inventory, and literally an hour and a half later, they revoked the offer. Yeah, before we even had a chance to really even
Review it, yeah.
figure out what we wanted to do.
Yeah, and that happens all the time, right? You know, they can do it anytime prior to unconditional acceptance. And this is very important to know, right? Because then you know that you can't go back and try to accept it. Could you try to work something out? Sure. But you've got to understand the way that these things, die. So in our standard offer to purchase and contract, Form 2T, there is no place to put it. And so you would have to put this expiration of offer in the additional provisions addendum. Now, I'm going to touch on these last two, and then I'm going to circle back around to another really just real world point that I like to make here, okay? So let's go to the next one and I'll circle back around. Destruction or death kills an offer. If you were to put an offer in on 123 Main Street and the property burns to the ground, your offer is dead. If the death of the offeror or death of the offeree, the offer is dead. Folks, the buyer and the seller are offerors and offerees, not the agents. Death of an individual licensee is not going to kill an offer. Death of the buyer, death of the seller, okay? The parties to the offer would kill an offer. Now, let me make a very important statement here. We are talking about offers, not contracts. Offers are the precursor to a contract. So if we were dealing with, Dale put an offer into Terry's property. Dale dies, that offer is dead. Dale puts an offer into Terry's property, Terry dies, that offer is dead. If it's just in offer territory, death of either party would kill the offer. But if it has turned into a contract, death of the parties does not kill a sales contract. I'm going to say that again. Death of the parties does not kill a sales contract. So if Dale sent an offer to Terry, Terry accepted it, they had a contract. Dale dies, we still have a contract. Terry dies, we still have a contract. We'll talk more about that later, but you have to understand that. Right now we're going to focus on the offers, but sales contracts survive death of the parties. Sales contracts survive death of the parties. Now the last one says failure to respond within a reasonable period of time. Let's play a fun game again, folks. Go over to the chat and tell me what is a reasonable period of time to respond to an offer. Depends. 3 days. 3 days. 3 days. 3 days. Depends. 5. Here's the problem, folks. I use this joke in 303, so some of you know the answer to this. What do you get when you mix an elephant and a rhino?
Hell if I know.
A hell if I know. There is no definition for what a reasonable period of time is. And so here's the problem, okay? Let's say that I had buyers who put in an offer on Ertley's house that he was a listing agent on. A week later, my buyers decide that that's been too long and they want to move on. So we put in an offer on another house and they get under contract on that other house. 2 days after that, Ertley sends a response and says, congratulations, my sellers accepted your offer. So now here's what happens. My buyers are like, no, it's been 9 days. That's too long to respond. And Ertley says, 9 days is very reasonable. And you know who gets to decide? Judge Judy. Judge Judy. Any day that you go to court is a bad day, folks. And so if your buyers have decided to move on from the property, what should you always do?
Notify.
Seller.
Revoke your offer. That's all it takes. So real world scenario, folks. I had clients who found a house that they were interested in about 1.5 years ago. We put an offer in on it. It was, a multiple offer situation. They sent us a notification. Best and final. All offers will be reviewed on this date and time. In the midst of that time happening, I showed them another property that they ended up loving. They wanted to put an offer. And so what we did is we turned around and all I had to do was send an email. We put an offer on the new house. I turned around and sent an email. Hey, in regard to that offer we put on your property, please do not consider our offer in the best and final evaluation. We are revoking our offer. That's all it took. And so we killed it. We moved on. Folks, don't ever leave an offer open to be accepted. That's the dangerous part. When it's alive, it can be accepted. And if you don't do that, you can be under contract twice. Then you're going to court, and anytime you or your clients are going to court, it's a bad day. Nobody wants to go to court. You done messed up, Ron, if somebody's in court. Now let me circle back around to the lapse of time and specified an offer. Folks, if you were going to put an expiration of offer on an offer, let me ask you your opinion here. What is a reasonable period of time to put on an expiration of offer? Meaning, how long do they have to respond to that offer? What would be a reasonable period of time there? Got a 3 days.
Yeah, I would agree. 72 hours, 3 days.
72, 3 days. Another 3 days. Let me give you some real world insight here, folks. 3 days, I think, is probably pretty reasonable, but let me give you a little bit of truth juice, all right? I have seen offers giving us 3 to 8 hours to respond. 3 to 8 hours. Now, folks, here's the thing. If you were ever enticed to put something like a couple of hours as an expiration of offer, here's the advice. Don't you do that unless it is the sexiest, thickest, most enticing offer you have ever sent in your life, okay? Because let me tell you what happens. you will offend the sellers, because when you send an offer over with an expiration of offer that's like 3 hours, and it's a mediocre offer at best, the sellers are laughing their butts off. Nobody likes to be put into a corner. You ever cornered a possum? What happens? All right? They will show their teeth. Sellers do the same thing. You put the sellers in the corner and they will lose their minds. So if you're going to send an expiration of offer and your offer is lackluster at best and you're only putting 3 hours, they're going to laugh at you. You're not going to get a response. You just wasted your time. Now here's the thing. If you send an expiration of offer that's a very short period of time, and that is a thick with 2 C's offer, that is the offer that you want to buy a drink and take home to meet your mama, then that offer is okay to have a short period of time. Let me give you a real world example of this. I had some clients, I listed their house in Fuquay, and much like Phil, the day I put it on the market, we got an offer, okay? The very first offer that came in, and it was going to be a hotcakes offer, or a hotcakes listing, because there were so many people scheduling showings. I knew there was going to be multiple offers. The very first offer that came in, I went to my sellers. I say, hey, listen, we got an offer. And they're like, wow, already? I said, yeah. I said, I got some good news and some bad news. And I said, okay. I said, here's the bad news. You got 5 hours or 4 hours, whatever it was, to respond to this offer. And my sellers were immediately like, 4 hours? That's stupid. We just put on the market. Who the hell do these people think they are, trying to tell us that we have to have 4 hours to respond? Is this normal? They were just rambling on. They were just mad. Why would they think that we're busy? We just got off of work. We haven't had a chance to do. They just kept going and kept going and kept going. And they're just mad, right? They were like, the audacity of these people giving us 4 hours to respond to an offer on the first, 4 hours after we listed it. And they said, all right, well, what's the offer? I said, well, that's the good news. It's for $90,000 over asking price. It's got $50,000 in due diligence, and it's closing in 30 days. And they said, well, 4 hours is pretty reasonable. I think we can make a decision on this and just, you'd say $90,000 over. Okay, $50,000 in non-refundable due diligence. I think these are very reasonable people. I think we can come to something. I mean, they just changed their tune just like that, because that was that thick with 2 C's offer, folks. If your offer is not sexy, okay, don't you dare send a 3-hour expiration of offer. If it's mediocre, $20,000 less than list, closing in 45 days, got a financing contingency, they are going to laugh all the way to the bank when that better offer comes in. But if it's a thick offer, you can put that pressure on. So I'm not telling you what to do. You run your business your way, but I'm telling you, some people, I've heard students come in like, oh, well, we always put a 24-hour on every offer that we do. And I always say, you probably shouldn't do that, because people don't like to be pressured. There's a time and a place to use this expiration of offer. Use it wisely. Don't make it an every time thing. And if you're going to make it an every time thing, just make it because you don't want to have to revoke it. And at that point, maybe 72 hours, 8 days, something reasonable. So just some real world advice there, right? Because I tell you, my sellers went from super offended to, okay, all right, real quick whenever I told them those terms. And they did, of course, accept that offer. And, we got a couple that came in after we accepted it, but, none of them actually beat that. There was like one that had slightly more due diligence, but the sales price was the same. So I was like, yeah, you made the right decision. And all's well that ends well. So just be cautious with, using it like it's going out of style. There's a time and a place to put those, expiration of offers, right?
So if I wanted to write the expiration of offer, that is in the additional provisions addendum?
Yep, it is number 1 on the additional provisions addendum. Now we're going to talk about that one. The additional provisions addendum is used to do 7 very specific things. I said 2 because I had to use this finger too. 7 very specific things. I used to teach it as 6, but they actually added in another one, so now I've had to adjust my teaching. It is 7 very specific things that the additional provisions addendum can be used for. That's number 1. We're going to talk about the other ones as time go on, but it's a very useful document to be aware of, that additional provisions addendum. Yeah. So we've been talking about the essential elements of contracts, and of course there's the 4 essential elements under basic contract law, but because we do deal with real estate in North Carolina, our sales contracts need to be in writing as well, so that's the 5th one, and we're going to talk about that. So we just got done talking about number 1, which is mutual agreement, also called reality of consent, mutuality of assent, mutuality of consent. There's a lot of different names, iterations that you could hear it as, But ultimately what it just comes down to is agreement, which is a big piece of the offer, the acceptance, and the communication of acceptance for people voluntarily entering into a contract, right? Moving from an offer to a contract, which is kind of the name of the game. So we talked about different ways offers could die and things of that nature. Now I will point out some other things that could impede that mutual assent in a moment. So right now we're talking about the next essential element, which is consideration. Now consideration is something of value. There has to be something of value exchanged for a contract to be enforceable, to be valid. Typically it is money on a contract, but it could be houses for houses in exchange. It could be cars for houses, could be money for cars, could be, anything of value. To that point, if you had a contract between parties to convey a house and you put $0 on there, it's not going to be enforceable in a court of law because it lacks consideration. So let's say that you had a contract that says, okay, well, I'm going to convey my house to you for $0, and the person refuses to then convey it to you. If you go to Judge Judy yet again and say, well, they didn't give me their house for free, they're going to look at you and they're going to say, we're not going to make this person give you their house for free. Now, if it had so much as $1, they would hear it out in court because it did have consideration. You're still probably going to lose because it would be overly or underly, gratuitous in that regard, not enough money. They typically don't get into what's enough and what's not, but for something like $1 for a house, they would probably invalidate it when it comes down to it. But it has to have something of value, okay? Something of value. Well, we've been talking about legal capacity of the parties, okay? They have to have the ability to contract. Told you the generalization here is 18, sane and sober. So 18 means you are a legal adult to make your own decisions. Of course, exceptions of necessities on the slide. If you have been emancipated or something like that, could change that. And then, of course, I said drunk as a skunk, high as a kite, also would be potentially voidable, just like a minor. If you are declared mentally incompetent by a court, like Britney Spears in her conservatorship, that is void. Toss it out, has no legal standing, not enforceable on either party. Now, we also said it has to have a lawful objective, okay? So no illegal acts. I gave you the example of crystal meth for murder. That is exceptionally illegal. And so obviously that would be a void contract if we had some type of contract for any illegalities. Maybe something a little less outright obvious would be discrimination. If there is a contract calling for some type of immoral performance, discrimination, not accepting an offer because, of a certain race or demographic, that would also constitute a void contract because it is also illegal. So anything illegal would constitute a void contract. Interesting to note, not in the contract discussion, but in documents discussion, of course, I told you restrictive covenants also fall under the statute of frauds and the Connor Act. And so there are restrictive covenants that exist nowadays that have things in them that are, as they sit today, illegal because some restrictive covenants have been around for so long. And so they are not enforceable in any way, shape, or form, even though they were recorded 60 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago. They have no legal standing because they now fall into supervening illegality. It's now illegal. When it wasn't when it was recorded, but it is now. So, of course, we all know that there is, probably some restrictive covenants that say, no people of color, or no people of certain religions, or no people of certain ethnicities. Toss it out. Has no legal standing. That is 1,000% illegal in today's laws and the way that we look at these things with fair housing and otherwise. So those are the 4 essential elements under basic contract law. But because we in this class are talking about real estate sales contracts, we will throw in writing. But writing is not actually an essential element of basic contract law. There are plenty of oral contracts that are enforceable. Plenty. It's just that contracts for the sale of real property are not enforceable. And so let me give you an example of this even before we get to the statute of frauds conversation, folks. There are, or it is outlined on the statute of frauds that leases in excess of 3 years have to be in writing under the statute of frauds in order to be enforceable in a court of law. What that means is leases less than 3 years in length, even when dealing with real property, are enforceable in a court of law even if they are not in writing. So if Steve and I agree that he's going to lease my house for $1,500 a month for 2 years, and it's a verbal agreement, if Steve stops paying me, of course I can take him to court. It wasn't required to be in writing because it was less than 3 years. Now, would it be exceptionally stupid for a landlord or a tenant to rely on an oral agreement? Yeah. But the point is not whether it's stupid or not. The point is whether they will hear it in court. If it's a verbal agreement for less than 3 years for a lease, even just verbal can be heard in court. If it was a lease in excess of 3 years, the statute of frauds stated it needed to be in writing. So plenty of oral contracts are enforceable. But oral contracts for the sale of real property are not enforceable in North Carolina because of our statute of frauds. Now, I told you there are several things that, if present, could change the actual outlook of that first component. That mutual assent, that meeting of the minds. And those are mistake, fraud, misrepresentation, and of course, duress and undue influence. So let's say that you contracted to purchase my property and I told you it was 300 acres. Well, in reality, it was only 250. Folks, that would give you the potential ability to get out. You were promised 300 acres. You contracted on what you thought was 300 acres. So even if it was intentional or not, that could change the outlook. If I did it fraudulently, that could potentially let you out of it. If I made a mistake and I actually believed it was 300, it could still let you out of it. It could make the contract potentially voidable or void if we could prove that it lacked that mutual agreement, that meeting of the minds. So whether it was intentional or not, if I promised you something and it wasn't true, like acreage or features, or you could put a septic, or any of these things could potentially render a contract void or voidable. Because they could argue that you did not have that mutual agreement, and that is an essential element of a contract. Now, I'm going to go off on a really scary tangent here, but it is important for you to understand as a real estate broker. Folks, we in North Carolina are bound and obligated by license law to disclose, more specifically discover and disclose, all reasonably ascertainable material facts. Okay? All reasonably ascertainable material facts. And we disclose them to everybody, clients and customers. Doesn't matter whom you represent. Well, here's where I'm going to scare you a little bit. In North Carolina, we have what we call the NC Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act, which basically applies to business professionals. If in the course of doing business, you did anything that would constitute a violation of the Unfair and Deceptive Trade Practices Act, you can be held liable and taken to court. And so if you were to provide a misleading opinion or false inducement, if you were to fail to disclose a material fact as we are legally obligated to do so, or mislead in advertising in any way, shape, or form, if you were, to misrepresent the level of guarantee, warranty, or, corrective action that could be in place for something, all of these could fall into this category. And if you're found guilty of any of these, you are potentially subject to what you would call treble damages. Let's say that you were to damage somebody in the value of $20,000 as determined by the courts. Treble means you could be ordered to pay back up to 3 times the amount of damage you caused. So that you injure them $20,000, you may have to pay back $60,000. Why is this scary? If you fail to disclose a material fact that you should have known and were legally obligated to, and your seller refuses to return due diligence money that they feel they're entitled to because of your wrongdoing, the buyers could potentially go after you and the seller in court and potentially be awarded damages for the loss of that money that the seller refuses to give back, because they would have never entered into that contract had you done your job as you were legally obligated to do. That's the scary part. You can be sued if you fail to disclose material facts that, if known and should have been known, would have prevented somebody from going under contract, because that would potentially render the contract void and they are going to seek to get all their money back. If it was me and I was a buyer's agent and I could prove that the listing agent did not disclose something that they should have known, I'm going to go after them that way, or at least tell my buyer to. So just keep this in mind. Now, this does not apply to for sale by owners because that's not a profession, but we are business professionals in our industry and as such are held to this. So just keep that in mind. Now, the other thing that I mentioned could prevent us from entering into mutual agreement, mutual assent, all those different names, was that duress or undue influence, okay? Duress, forcing the contract by violence or threat, and undue influence is more of an emotional aspect. So if you hold a gun to somebody's head, that is duress. You say, sign this contract or I'll blow your brains out. Of course they're going to sign it. But did they want to enter into that contract? Probably not. And so if you can prove that you were forced to sign a contract by threat of violence, that would be duress. You could yet again prove that you lacked mutual consent or mutuality of assent or whatever you want to call it. Same thing with undue influence. Not necessarily threat of physical violence, but threat of some type of emotional pull that you have on somebody. If you were to go to your elderly parent and say, if you don't list your house for sale, I'm putting you in a nursing home and I will never visit you. You're not threatening to hurt them, but couldn't that have some sway on somebody and force them into a contract? If you can prove these things, yet again, this could potentially make the contract voidable by the party who experienced the duress or undue influence. So I keep talking about the statute of frauds, which is a very important thing within the real estate world. Every state has their own statute of frauds, and North Carolina is no different, so we've always been teaching you ours. And so I told you there are certain documents named in the statute of frauds. So let me say this one more time. If it is a document that is named in the statute of frauds, it needs to be in writing to be enforceable in a court of law. If they don't specifically name it, it is very much enforceable even as an oral agreement. So a little excerpt from it says, all contracts to sell or convey any lands and all other leases and contracts for leasing land exceeding 3 years from the making shall be void unless put in writing and signed by the party to be charged therewith. So I told you the verbiage actually says void. Now, when we're looking at this, this is just two very big ones that pertain to us. Leases dealing with real estate in excess of 3 years, and sales contracts dealing with real estate. Told you the other things, promissory notes, deeds, restrictive covenants, easements, all these different things are in there. But if it's not named in that list, it's enforceable even if it's not in writing. But since we deal with real estate, all of our contracts need to be in writing. Now, the last two notes here says includes all contract modifications. Folks, you can't change anything in a contract unless all parties agree. It goes back to that mutual agreement. So if we're under contract and we want to change the price, we both have to agree to it. And we could amend it. And the parole evidence rule says only what's in the contract is part of the contract. So if we want to change it, we both need to go in and make that change and acknowledge it. If we agree to something outside of the contract, it's not enforceable in a court of law. That's very important to understand. So if we get a written agreement for the sale of the property, and we're all under contract, and then later the buyer and the seller agree orally that the sellers are going to leave the washer and the dryer for the buyer. When the seller does not leave the washer and dryer, the buyer has no recourse because it wasn't part of the contract. It was an oral agreement. So only what's in the contract is part of the contract. That is what the parole evidence rule states. Okay? Only what's in the contract is part of the contract. Now, a couple notes here. Of course, when we're dealing with the statute of frauds, there are certain things that have to be present as outlined under the more detailed aspects of the statute of frauds. We got to have the names of the parties to the contract, the subject matter of the contract, what are the promises, what are the obligations, all material terms and conditions, and of course the signatures of the parties to be charged. In other words, the signers of the contract. Whoever the parties are, they need to sign it so that we show that they're in agreement. So, another thing that I've already mentioned, and now it's going to come to fruition here in the slides, is the UETA, the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, okay, UETA. And it is the legislation that was passed to basically say that everything in digital world is as legally binding as wet signatures. So this is the reason why you can sign things digitally. This is the reason why email and text and phone communications are good for that communication of acceptance. All you have to do is accept it as your signature. So as long as the parties agreed to use electronic means, then it is as legally binding. It's the same reason why you can, digitally sign on things at the grocery store, not with an actual pen. Called the UETA, Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. So when we're dealing with this, what comes into play is, of course, your digital format signature programs. DocuSign, DigiSign, DotLoop, SkySlope, whatever it is you utilize. So, Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. This is the reason why I'm telling you all these programs work. DotLoop, DigiSign, DocuSign, all these things. Now, more in depth, what I was saying is there are certain aspects or disclosure items required in order to fully comply with the UETA. These are typically built into the back end to the programs if somebody wanted to research them a little bit more. And so the 5 disclosure items required for the parties. The right to have the record in the paper format. So even though they have agreed to digital signatures, they have the right to have a paper copy of it. They have the right to revoke consent from electronic means, meaning just because they've elected to use electronic means does not mean that they have to use it forever. They can revoke that right and switch back to not using electronic signatures as enforceable for them. They have the right to identify for specific transactions, meaning they say, well, I will use my electronic signature for this transaction, but none others. They have that right. They can revoke it at any time. Procedure to follow to withdraw consent. They have to be made aware of how they say, no, I no longer want to use it. And then, of course, they need to know how to obtain the copy of the file in a paper format. What does that look like? Emailing us, asking for a printed copy, printing it on their own. And all these programs have the ability for them to download and print. So a lot of this is kind of built in onto the back end of your different programs and something we just kind of, breeze over. But they do have all these rights, so just keep that in mind from a deeper rooted context of the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. So we've got this kind of discussion about the UETA and the mutual agreement and all these other pieces, kind of ironed out. I want to switch gears here for a second. A lot of this we've been talking about, offers and how an offer becomes a contract. So in that conversation, we talked about how an offer dies. Well, now we're switching gears, and I want you to understand how a contract is a very different thing, how a contract dies, how a contract ends, okay, which is exceptionally different than an offer. So the ways that a contract can end, well, let's start with the best one, full performance. We did what we said we were going to do. It doesn't matter which type of contract we're talking about, that is the best way for any contract to end. If it's a sales contract, buyer gives the seller money, seller gives the buyer house. Full performance, dunsies. If we're dealing with a listing agreement, we helped them sell their house, they paid us. Dunsies. Doesn't matter what type of contract, the best way for a contract to end is full performance. All obligations and promises were fulfilled, which would make it a executed contract, right? Fully completed, discharged. Well, there are other ways for contracts to end, other ways that contracts can die. So let's start with the subsections under agreements of the parties. And we'll use the word agreement loosely here. So release by agreement. If we have mutual agreement, every contract will end. I'm going to say that again. Mutual agreement will kill every single contract ever. So let me use an agency contract and a sales contract as an example. If I had a listing agreement with Sam that said Sam was giving me 6 months to sell his house, and Sam wakes up one day and says, Seth, I hate your face. I don't want to work with you anymore. Folks, Sam can't get out of the agreement just because he wakes up one morning and hates my face. I get to look Sam in the face and go, neener, neener, neener. We have a contract. Sucks to be you. That's the whole point. Contracts are enforceable between parties. So one person wanting out is not an agreement. That is one person wanting out. Now, I'm going to tell you something. For me personally, as a real estate broker, I have a policy. If you don't want to work with me, I don't want to work with you. So if Sam wakes up one day and he says he hates my guts and doesn't work with me anymore, I say, great, Sam, I don't want to work with you either. Don't let the door hit you where the dog should have bit you. And so if Sam and I mutually agree, our contract is dead. Mutual agreement will always kill a contract. Listing agreements, buyer agency agreements, sales contracts. If all parties agree to end it, it's done. Now, a novation, I'm not going to get too in-depth here. I'll give you the kind of abridged version because, yet again, depending on who you ask, if you ask a law student or if you ask a real estate instructor, you're going to get a different answer on a novation. But a novation is what we call a substitution of the contract. Let me give you two examples here. Let's say that we were under contract and we started, wanting to renegotiate it and change some terms. And our way of amending the contract was to put strike through initial date, strike through initial date, strike through initial date. Legally speaking, that's okay. But I want you to picture a contract that we have that has 17 strike throughs with initials and dates. At a certain point, that gets very mucky, right? Very hard to read it, and what are we even agreeing to? So we could look at each other and say, hey, listen, I don't even know what the hell we agreed to anymore. Let's draft up a new contract, sign this one agreeing to it, and let's just consider the last one forgiven and forgotten. That would be a novation. We created a new contract that we accepted as the current contract, and we just said the old one's out. Everybody okay with that statement? That'd be a type of novation. The other way that you could see a novation, let's say that Dale owned a commercial building, and he signed a 10-year lease with me to open a cupcake shop. 3 years in, my cupcake business is booming. I am making oodles and oodles of money. Caroline wants to get in the cupcake business, so she comes and she offers to buy my cupcake shop. I go to Dale. I say, Dale, hey, listen, I'm selling my cupcake business. There's 7 years left on my 10-year lease. How do you want to handle it? Dale could say, well, as opposed to Caroline taking over your 7 years, have Caroline call me and I will renegotiate a new 10-year lease with Caroline. And then he would forgive and forget my old one. That would also be a novation. We've got a new 10-year lease with a new tenant. We will forgive and forget the old one. That's all a novation is. Okay? Got a new contract. We don't care about the old one anymore. But this also is an agreement to the parties. The parties have to agree that the new one's in place, that the old one's out. Now, modifying terms of a contract, I told you, that cannot be done without agreement of the parties. Folks, before we even get into the more in-depth conversations in this class, let me make sure you understand something. Whatever is important to your client better be in the contract from the word go. You cannot add anything after. Let me tell you a very scary story. I had an acquaintance who I met at a grand opening of one of my friend's lending offices that I went to as an instructor. So I went as an instructor and I met some people, and this acquaintance, gave me her business card, and I told her I was an instructor. She's like, oh my God, you'd be such a great person to know because, I'm new in this business and yada, yada, yada. So she never actually ended up taking any of my classes, but I'm like, sure, here's my business card. And so she reached out to me a couple weeks, months later. Seth, oh my God, you got a second? I got a crazy situation. I need your advice on it. I said, shoot, what you got? She said, okay, well, and number one, this was a really weird situation. I would have probably never even tackled this transaction, but when you're new in the business, you want any and all deals that fall into your lap, okay? So it was this really weird situation where the seller had won the house that they owned in a settlement through a lawsuit, through like a family member. They won the house. The house was like gifted to them. I don't even know how that happens, but so they legally own the house because of some lawsuit they won. But these sellers were cash poor. They didn't have a dime to their name. So they were selling the house, and she was representing the seller. And this seller could not afford anywhere else to go and did not have anyone else to stay with, probably because he sued family members and stole a house. So, of course, no family's going to help him out. But I digress. So he needed a lease back so he could close on the house, get the money, use the money to find a new place to live, and then move out. Everybody following with me here? So buyers put in an offer on this listing that this acquaintance was the listing agent on. And they went back and forth, back and forth. They finally came to terms, and the seller signed the offer. She got it under contract. Oops. In the many iterations of the contract, the final one that was signed and agreed to did not include the leaseback option. So she called me up and she said, Seth, we got a contract and they agreed to give us a lease back, but it never made it into the contract. And now that I'm going and asking about the lease back, they're, not wanting to give it to us. And I said, yeah, you've screwed yourself. They don't have to. You've got an actual legal agreement, as long as it was communicated and accepted. And so you cannot add anything into the contract now that it's a contract, unless all parties agree. And there is zero obligation for any parties to agree. And she's like, well, my sellers have to have this lease back. Otherwise, they're going to be homeless. They can't do this, what I do. And I told her, I said, listen, here's the thing. You're screwed, but if it were me, and then I preface this with, remember, this is not legal advice, and you should probably have your seller consult an attorney. If it were me, I would probably suggest that we terminate right now and breach the contract and have our fingers crossed that they're not going to go after us. Because if you breach the contract one day into the contract, they're probably not willing to go to court and go after you. If you breach the contract after 2 months of due diligence and all these other things, they are going to have the time to go after you. So while it's not legal advice, you may want to just roll the dice and see if they'll go after you, and the judge would go easy on you if they do right now versus getting to the day of closing. After 45 days of them wasting time and money, they're a lot more likely to go after you. I don't know what ended up happening with it, but the point is you cannot add anything into the contract without all parties agreeing. So
This is an offer to purchase, right?
yeah.
I'm about to be in this situation, so.
Wait, the screwed situation or the submitting an offer situation?
Accepting an offer. I have a client, I have a listing. They're military, but they're they're hoping the house doesn't sell so quick because they can't leave yet. So that's going to be an option that we're going to kind of leave open. So this was very informative.
Yeah, well, so, yeah, you would need to, you might want to just negotiate, put it in the agent remarks if they need more time. Hey, let me tell you a cool story, Jaleesa. If your sellers do not want to be under contract quick because they need it to take longer because they need to figure out where they're going to go, spell it out. You will be surprised that there is sometimes this match made in heaven kind of circumstance. I'll give you a real world example of this. I had clients who, the wife I went to school with in high school, and her and her husband were both military. They moved away. They were in Georgia. They bought a house in Georgia, and they decided to come back to the area. So she posted that she was come back to the area, and I was a real estate agent. Of course, being the good real estate agent I was, I messaged her on Facebook. I said, hey, I'm a real estate agent. If you got somebody, great. If not, I'd be happy to help you and your husband look for something. Let me know if I can help you in any way, shape, and form. She texted me back and she said, well, actually, we have a house in Georgia. We're just looking to rent first while we try to figure out if we want to buy here. I said, well, even with that, I'll help you if you want me to. I'm happy to help you with a. She was a good friend, and so I said, yeah, I'll help you with a rental. So I did. I helped them find a rental, and it was actually one of the biggest commission checks I've ever made with a rental. It was a company that was offering like 1 month of rent as a commission. So it was like a $1,600 commission on a rental. So I helped them with that. Now here's where the story comes into this. Not probably 3 months after they signed a 1-year lease, the house popped up on the market. And I guess she was scrolling on Zillow and she sent it to me. She's like, oh my God, this house is so cute. I love this house. I'd love to go see this house. Even though I can't buy anything, is there any way we can go look at it? I said, absolutely. I'll be happy to take you. I understand that you still got all this time on your lease. Let's go look at the house. We go and look at it, and she loves the house. And she wants to put an offer in on it because she loves it so much. But here they are with 9 months left in their lease. Well, I went to the agent remarks and it said something along the lines of willing to, field a longer closing period or a leaseback option or something like that. I picked up the phone, I called the listing agent, I explained to them our situation. They said, honestly, that's fantastic. They said, we're building a new construction house. And so we will give you, we'll get under contract, we'll close on it because my people had the ability to buy. And then we negotiated like a 7-month lease back. So the sellers closed on the house, my buyers bought it. And then they leased it back so they didn't even have to break their lease, but for like 1 month early. So put that in the agent remarks because sometimes there's just this match made in heaven where somebody wants the house, but they're not ready to move in either because they've got a lease.
Okay, so put it in the agent's remarks on the MLS, and then when somebody submits an offer, make sure that it's on the on the OTP.
Always make sure it's on the contract. So if your seller wants to, if the buyer has the ability to close, that's ideal, right? Close and then do a lease back. It's called a seller possession after closing agreement. And we'll talk a little bit about those down the road. Yeah, so you make sure that you put it in there. Let me tell you another really important real-world example of kind of some of these things we're talking about, okay? I just told you that you can't change the terms of a contract without agreement of all the parties. And so that would be modifying the contract, and if all parties agree, we can change anything. But if they're not willing to agree, then you can't change it. Well, let's talk about this next one. An accord or satisfaction, okay? It's where one party compromises. And I started off the day and I said, do you think there's ever a time where your buyer may not get everything that they were promised, or your seller may not ever get everything they're promised? Of course. So I'm going to give you a real world example, and this is a true story, and this was a mess up that I made when I was newer in the business. Do you remember where I showed you that the offer to purchase and contract had changed, and that this past year they added in exercise/workout equipment? You saw that? Remember that? Yeah. It changes pretty regularly. To put it in perspective, when I got in the business, it was 13 pages. It's been 8 years, it's 17 pages now, okay? And so I remember sitting through these classes, and I think I was probably still a provisional broker at the time that this happened. And so let me preface this with, when you looked at the offer to purchase and contract at the time that I'm referring to, and it outlined a hot tub/spa. The way that it was actually articulated at the time was that if the hot tub was on a freestanding slab, it was considered personal property the seller could remove. If it was built into a deck or otherwise, it was a fixture that had to stay. Does that make sense for everybody? At the time that I'm referring to, that's how it was written. And I knew this. So I had my first listing come up that had a hot tub. And so it was just sitting on a slab. And so it was considered personal property at the time. So I went to the seller and I said, hey, listen, your hot tub is technically considered personal property. So you can leave it or you can take it with you unless, we have an agreement to the contrary. He said, okay. I said, so what do you want to do? And he said, well, Seth, to be honest, I don't even know if it works. I haven't used the thing in over a year. It's just been sitting here. And I don't really care about it because the new house I'm building, I'm getting a new hot tub. And he was building a over $1 million house. Okay, so everybody following along here. The seller said they didn't care either way about the hot tub. Didn't know if it worked, but he didn't care. So here's what I did. I went to the MLS when I listed the property, and I put in the agent remarks, if you want the hot tub, ask for it. Otherwise, we will remove it because we don't know if it works. Okay, that's what I put. Well, I list the house. A couple days later, we get an offer. We go into a contract. They didn't want the hot tub. Okay, they didn't ask for it. So I had to go to the seller. I said, okay, they didn't want the hot tub. Guess we're just going to get rid of it. He said, okay, well, how do we get rid of a hot tub? I said, well, honestly, if you put it like for free on Craigslist or Facebook, because this was back before Craigslist was super scammy, I said, if you put it for free on there, somebody will take it. Tomorrow. And he says, Seth, well, I'm really busy with work. Would you handle that for me? I said, sure. So we had a little bit more of a conversation on the hot tub, and we agreed to get rid of it, okay? So we get rid of the hot tub. It's gone. Contract continues to move on. And then when we get to the day of the final walkthrough, the buyer's agent and the buyer goes over there. They're doing the final walkthrough, and I get a phone call from the buyer's agent. And he says, hey, Seth, everything looks good except where's the hot tub? I say, what you mean, my boy? You mean the hot tub you didn't ask for? The one that we said we were going to get rid of if you didn't ask for it? It's gone. Mm-hmm. So here's what had happened was, folks, and so this is why I have a segment in this class called What Had Happened Was. The first one I made up. That never happened to me, but it's happened to a lot of people with the refrigerator. Okay, it really does happen, but it hasn't happened to me. This one actually happened to me. What had happened was this transaction took place right after July sometime. The contract had been updated, and they had changed the verbiage to what it is now. It no longer stated that freestanding hot tubs were personal property and that built-in hot tubs were fixtures. All hot tubs are fixtures. Hot tub/spa excluding inflatable. The way that it reads right now is what it stated. And I didn't realize that change. So what that means is, when they put the offer in, I was expecting them to go in and ask for it as personal property to convey at no cost, which they didn't do. So in my mind, I thought I was doing them a huge favor, because you know what, folks? You know what a hot tub that doesn't work is?
Worthless.
Worthless, more specifically,
Oh.
a 900-pound paperweight.
Yeah.
They are big, they are bulky, they are heavy. Bugs and frogs and all kinds of things breed in them. They are just a mosquito. I mean, nobody wants a hot tub that doesn't work in their yard, especially if you don't want it. So we had articulated that to help them out. If you want it, it's yours. If you don't, we will be nice and get rid of it to help you out. They didn't ask for it, so we got rid of it to help them out. But because the contract had been updated to state that it was a fixture that was supposed to convey, legally speaking, the parole evidence rule kicks in. Only what's in the contract is part of the contract. At the time they put in that offer, there was a hot tub. Today, on the day of closing, there was no hot tub. So I picked up the phone and I called my attorney and I said, here's the scenario. What do I do? He said, legally, they're right. You are supposed to have a hot tub for them, because when they put that offer in, there was one that existed. We never put it in as an exclusion. They didn't need to ask for it. And so while you did put that very detailed point in the multiple listing service, the parole evidence rule says only what was in the contract will be administered in a court of law. So if it goes to court, they will probably not care what was in the MLS, and they will probably win. So he said you can do one of two things. You can give them a hot tub, or I guess three things. Give them a hot tub, give them a credit, or tell them to go to hell and bank on the fact that it's not worth them going to court over. So I went back to my boss at the time, because even though I was a newer broker, I started managing firms pretty early. So I was managing a firm, but I had a guy that I worked for who was technically the BIC. And I went back to him and I explained everything that happened. And it's interesting to note that the seller of this property was my boss's business partner's son, who also had a business interest in another entity. So he was loaded. He had plenty of money. So everybody was on the same page. The seller said, listen, I'm not worried about it. I'll cut him a check. I'll do whatever I need to do. It's an honest mistake. So he wasn't mad. I offered to fix it. And I said, no, it was my mistake. I'll fix it. But here's what my boss said. My boss was a very pompous guy who liked to pee into the wind to see what would happen. Okay. And so he said, no, tell him to go to hell. I said, what? He said, yeah, tell him to go to hell. Tell them they can sue us in court and we'll be happy to see him in court. So we got permission from the seller to make sure that the seller was okay with that. And the seller said, yeah, whatever you want to do. So I went back to the buyer's agent. I said, listen, I get what you're saying. Legally, you're right. But I was very clear in my instructions. We should have had a conversation about this. We were trying to help you out. So go to hell. If you want to take us to court, go ahead. Otherwise, you can close. But what do you think they elected to do?
Went to court.
They closed. This hot tub that may or may not have worked was not going to court over, worth going to court over. Folks, you have to understand that you can't have your cake and eat it too, because if they wanted to close on the house that day, they had to just accept it. Otherwise, they would have had to wait probably months to buy that house. So this is where I'm telling you that a contract is only worth anything if you're willing to go to court. If you're not, you better learn to just suck it up, buttercup, because there's going to be a lot of times that you don't get what you thought you were going to get. Now, I want you to understand something here, folks. This is where I keep telling you that contracts have to be stupid proof. And here's why. Folks, listen to this. I was wrong. I messed up. It was my fault. My client suffered none. I won. This buyer legally was entitled to a hot tub. The buyer's agent legally didn't have to ask for it. But they did not get a hot tub and they had to just suck it up, buttercup. They lost. The thing is, all it would have taken for them to have won was to pick up the phone and get us on the same page before they put that offer in. Hey, Seth, we do want the hot tub, but there's no need to put it on the contract because it's been updated and it's actually included as a fixture that says the seller should have to leave it. If he would have made that phone call, we would have been on the same page. He would have gotten a hot tub and they would have won. So sometimes you can do quote unquote everything right and still lose, which is why we have to make these contracts stupid proof. It was one phone call, one text for clarity that would have caused this whole thing from not being an issue. But that never happened because we were so willing to leave it. We were trying to help them out when we got rid of it. So this goes back to the shed thing. We need to get on the same page. Just because you know now that a shed is a fixture, don't you ever assume that the other agent on the other side of the deal knows that. You need to make sure that if there's any ambiguities, we clarify them. For me, 8 years in the business, if I have a client who wants the shed, I write it into personal property. Not because I legally have to, but because I'm concerned that the other agent is stupid and doesn't know that it's a fixture. No offense to you folks. I'm not calling you stupid because y'all are still learning. But do you see what I'm saying? You've got to make these things stupid proof. Because it all comes down to whether or not you're willing to go to court. Now, here's the thing. I found out later that this agent was representing an investor. This guy was buying the house and his daughter was going to live in it while she went to college here. So the father probably didn't care one way or another, and he was initially working with the father. The daughter, who was going to be living there, did the final walkthrough. So I'm pretty sure the agent didn't ask for it because he didn't know if it was going to work, and the father didn't care one way or another. But I think the daughter at the final walkthrough thought it would be cool to have a hot tub with her friends in college to sit in, and probably started complaining about it. And he was trying to save some face, and he found out that, it was actually in there and tried to use that to his advantage. He still lost, though. So this is what you call an accord or a satisfaction, also called partial performance or substantive performance. You decided to close even though you did not get everything you were promised. You just said, okay, I'm still going to close anyway. But I was wrong, and this is a 1,000% true story. So the last one on this doesn't necessarily fall into, this section per se. Cancellation, it says an example like a promissory notice paid. If we had some kind of contract like a promissory note to a bank and you made the final payment, that is where the party would basically record a satisfaction or a cancellation saying, okay, I no longer have any obligation against this property or anything like that. That doesn't really come into play for sales contracts as we know them. But of course, the other ones that I mentioned in there do come into play quite a bit. Mutual agreement, party not fulfilling their obligations, partial performance, substantial performance. These are all things that you need to be very aware of. When you breach a contract, folks, that is where somebody would potentially have the right to go after you. But if they elect not to go after you, that means they may just say, okay, well, I'll close anyway. And I'm going to give you some real additional insight as we start looking at the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T, which will start tomorrow, okay? So a couple other ways that contracts can end. Breach typically gives the non-breaching party the right to terminate, subject to remedies or penalties. Impossibility of performance could be a couple different ways. If we were under contract to buy a house and the house burns down, it would now be impossible to perform, meaning you cannot deliver me the house you promised me in the time frame you promised me it at, right? That would be impossibility of performance. Of course, there's also operation of law that could also constitute impossibility of performance. If you were under contract to buy a house, and then the government comes in and they say, we're taking this house by way of eminent domain, you can't sell it anymore because now the government owns it. So that would be operation of law that could kill a contract, or yet again, impossibility of performance. Bankruptcy protections preventing the house from being sold. Lawsuits preventing it from being sold. All of these could cause it to kill the contract under these contexts. And then we talked about just a few moments ago a novation. A novation was a substitution of contract. Well, an assignment is a substitution of parties. So let's say that I was under contract to buy Cole's house, and maybe Steve comes along and says, Seth, I really like that house. Would you consider letting me take over that contract? I could potentially take that contract and assign it to Steve to buy Cole's house. Nothing has changed in the terms, but one of the parties has changed. That's called an assignment. It's basically the whole concept of wholesaling. Wholesaling is selling a contract. And so understand that if we're using the 2T, you cannot assign a contract without the consent of both parties. Buyer and seller have to consent. Some contracts are written in a way where it says, or assigns, which basically says I'm allowed to assign it as long as the terms don't change. And of course, other versions of assignments would be, subleases, or just, assigning a lease. All of those could kind of come into a similar facet. The big question, though, for an assignment is, okay, well, does the original assignor, do they maintain a level of liability, or are they absolved completely? And that depends on the rights and obligations under the assignment. Just depends.
He sent the that contract, the 2T. The reason you have to have both in there is because it's worded like that, correct? The contract 2T.
Yeah. The reason why we call it that.
No, the reason you have to have both parties consent.
Yes, because it actually says that in the verbiage. That's exactly right. It basically says, assignment requires authority of both seller and buyer. It says that in the actual verbiage.
Because I think you can assign any contract unless it strictly prohibits it.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. An assignment, in theory, somebody could, and this is where the courts come into play, right? If you've got a contract that doesn't say you can't assign it and you attempt to assign it, they could take it to court and say, okay, well, if I knew they were going to assign it, then I wouldn't have agreed to it. And so then it could lack that mutual agreement. But, that's why you want to be clear in the contracts, because you want them to, either know I have the right to assign it or I don't. Otherwise, there's that question of, does that change things? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, we've already talked about some of these things. We're about to kind of wrap up some of these discussions for the day. And if time allows, which it looks like we might get there, I got a fun-filled activity to wrap up the day, which is a great learning activity. So, I've already talked about the parole evidence rule that says only what's in the contract is part of the contract. That's why it's so important to make sure any verbal agreements get put in writing. Let me give you a real-world example of this. If I am a listing agent, it is not uncommon in the midst of getting their house ready to sell that the sellers say, okay, well, Seth, we don't really want this entertainment center. Will you ask the buyer's agent to ask the buyers if they want it? And that's very common, right? We'll say, hey, they don't want this furniture. Do you want it? And if the buyer says yes, if I was the buyer's agent, I'd say, hey, listen, they're just offering this to us. We're verbally agreeing that you want it. So if they leave it, great, be excited. If they don't leave it, you can't go after them because it's just a verbal agreement that they said, do you want this? And we said yes. Unless we want to go through the effort to put it in writing and add it to the contract, it's not something that you can go after them for. So same thing's true of, when you put in an offer, you've got to very clearly ask for stuff, no matter what it is. You got to ask for it. If it's not in the contract, they have no legal obligation to leave it for you. Now, the rest of this contract is to be interpreted as a whole, no matter how many addenda, no matter how many times we've amended it, no matter how many strike-throughs. We have to look at the big picture. 72 changes, great. Let's interpret it as all 72 changes. And we're going to look at different ways that they have made that easier when we get to the main amendment that we use in North Carolina. And of course, written provisions and added provisions will override the standard pre-printed language in the contract. So the contract will say this is going to happen. But then if we have an addenda attached to it that says, nope, this is going to supersede that, yeah, of course it's going to override it. And the last one says the writer of ambiguous language could be held liable for confusion. This just is what I've been saying this whole time. Make it stupid proof. Because if you just put refrigerator, you have screwed yourself or your client. If you don't clarify what's staying, what's going, you've screwed yourself. If you don't clarify dates, you've screwed yourself. You got to be very specific in all of it. On a side note, it's a little better. It's like he's way more muffled, so like I can still hear it, but it's so faint. So I can focus a little bit better now. Just hope he's not chewing through the door or anything.
I've heard of people putting a little bit of Benadryl in the dog food. I've never done it, but I've just heard of that.
Well, you know, the thing is, he had chilled out a lot, but so this past weekend, we had a lot going on, and so he was in doggy daycare. So I think maybe he got like a little like anxiety about being in doggy daycare over the weekend, and then, you know, riding in the car and stuff. And so I think he's got like some overexcitement, because like last week he was way more calm, but the problem is he just had doggy daycare, and then my wife and the kids left, so he's down there by himself, and he was in the kennel. So I think he's just like, you're losing his mind. If he's out and they're here, he's cool. But if he's abandoned and, you know, there's nobody around and he can hear my voice, he's just going nuts. So I'm going to have to make it a rule where they can't leave while I'm teaching, or they have to take the dog with them.
Don't drug him. Don't drug him.
I'm not, they do make like doggy anxiety meds that are actually like prescribed. So, you know, I've considered that for some of his stuff. Yeah. But he's overall a good dog. He's just very excitable because he's still young, but he's fine.
They do make earmuffs for dogs, you know, to cut your noise. So be mindful of that.
It's his noise that is bothering me, so I'm gonna wear the earmuffs.
But your noise is bothering him.
Oh, you're right. Okay, I gotcha. So me talking. So if I put although I don't know that he'd keep them on. Does he have like a little clip under his chin to keep it there? He must. All right. Yeah. Who knows? Hopefully, like I said, this is better, so I'll just keep him in the bathroom. He'll be fine. Let's talk about what happens if you don't do what you said you're going to do, folks. Okay, we keep calling it a breach. Well, breach means you haven't fulfilled your promises in some way, shape, or form. Well, when you breach, it typically gives the non-breaching party the right to terminate and or go after you for what we call damages or remedies. A remedy is you messed up when you were not legally allowed to, and so now we're going after you in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so we've got different remedies. Well, let's talk about the monetary side of the remedies first, what we call money damages. The first one is compensatory damages. And the root word of that is to compensate. In other words, return me to the position I was in before you done did me wrong. Okay? However much money I've lost, reimburse me. Make me whole. That's all compensatory damages is. So I've spent $6,000 and you terminated or you breached, repay me my $6,000. Okay, that is compensatory damages. I want you to make me whole. Consequential damages, think consequences. They may not be as easily identifiable. They're not necessarily, I lost this much. I want you to think of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard in this regard, okay? You remember those crazy cases that we were all watching, you know, with Johnny Depp and Amber Heard pooped on his pillow, and it was just this crazy nutso thing that all went down. She was lying about stuff that she said Johnny did, and so that was the whole point. It was a defamation lawsuit. Well, it didn't cost him any money directly, but he lost future rights to profits because he lost out on major movie roles that he would have been hired because they didn't want the bad publicity with him being brought into it. So he sued for consequential damages. You lost me millions of dollars in movie parts because of your defamation, and so I want to be reimbursed for lost profits that I potentially missed out on. Okay, that is consequential damages. Future profits that you caused me to lose out on, maybe not an exact number that we know, but you know, we're going after you for it. This would also be true if you got injured and, like, you know, God forbid, you got a crazy injury and became paralyzed for the rest of your life. It wouldn't be enough to just pay for your medical bills. You've lost the ability to work for the rest of your life. And so they've got to look at that. That's why people who get injured and paralyzed get millions of dollars. They look at what you would have made over the next 40 years of working, and so that's future lost profits. Those are consequential damages. To tie it into real estate, let's say that you are going to buy a property that was being advertised as a turnkey Airbnb, close on it and start making money, and in reality it did not have appropriate permits, was not approved as an Airbnb, and when you closed it was 3 months from the time that you could actually market it as a rental, then you could potentially sue them for consequential damages. You promised me it was turnkey and I was going to make money the day I closed on it. That was not the case. Now, the last one here is liquidated damages. Liquidated damages are a pre-negotiated amount. If I mess up, here's what you get. Liquidated damages. The most common example of that is earnest money. Now, I want you to think about this. I told you when you terminate during due diligence, you have not breached the contract as a buyer in North Carolina because you have purchased that right to terminate for any reason or no reason. But if you terminate after due diligence, I told you it's called what?
Breach of contract.
Breach of contract. And so earnest money is money that goes into an escrow account where you tell the seller, if I breach contract, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's what you're entitled to. So earnest money is liquidated damages. If I mess up, here's what you get. It is pre-negotiated on the contract. It's called liquidated damages. Now, these are not the only remedies that exist in the entire world. There is one other remedy we need to throw into the mix. Okay? And it is not monetary. It is action-based. So it is called specific performance. Well, remember, the parties make promises, and the promises being fulfilled is called performance. So specific performance is a lawsuit where you basically force Judge Judy to make them do what they said they were going to do. Now, under basic contract law, this is for anyone. But if we're dealing with the offer to purchase and contract standard form 2T in North Carolina, this is only a remedy available to a buyer. These sellers do not have the right to go after a buyer for specific performance when using the 2T. So let's say that the seller changes their mind and they don't want to sell to you anymore. You can take the seller to court and sue them for specific performance, which is basically where you say, Judge Judy, you forced them to sell me their house. And believe it or not, it is not a hard case to win because of the uniqueness of property. No two pieces are alike. The seller promised to sell it. They can and sometimes are forced to sell it. It's called specific performance. Folks, I'm going to tell you another real world story here of how this comes to play. Those same clients that I was just referring to with the rental and then purchasing the house, well, fast forward to a few years later when that dream house I helped them buy and lease back from with the sellers, they decided to sell it. And they called me when they wanted to buy another one. Well, they loved their neighborhood, but they had another kid, and so they wanted to expand into a bigger house. And so what they did was they reached out to their Facebook group for their neighborhood and said, hey, we live in the neighborhood, we love the neighborhood, we want to stay in the neighborhood. Is anybody thinking about selling that has a house at least, this size and yada, yada, yada? And there were some sellers that were in the Facebook group and they said, yeah, we're actually thinking about selling our house. And so they started kind of talking about potentially selling. And of course, these friends of mine, they said, Seth, we really don't want to do this without you because we don't know what we're doing. But they're willing to sell it and we want to buy their house. So they brought me in on it. And so the sellers agreed that I could come in and represent them as their buyer's agent. The sellers had an agent that was potentially going to list their house, but this never made it to listing. So we basically started negotiating an off-market deal. Well, this was happening at the, middle of COVID, middle of 2020, like it had been around for a couple months. And we weren't really sure what the real estate market was going to do. It had started to decline, but we weren't really sure. Interest rates were going down. And so we came up with a number that we thought was fair at the time for their house. Now, let me put in perspective for you. My people were selling let's just call it 123 Main Street. And they wanted to turn around and buy this other house that I was not representing. So I was a listing agent helping them buy, 202 Walnut Street. At the time that I facilitated this deal, I looked at their house and I said, okay, well, we could probably sell your house for $355. Now, they had bought it a few years prior for $325, so not a crazy amount of appreciation, but they're making some money on it. And then this house was larger, and so we had kind of looked at some comps, and somewhere they came up with a number of about $390. So, you know, about $35,000 more than what they were selling theirs for, but it was a bigger house. Now, when I ran the numbers, I was more than comfortable with that price. I said, yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, it could probably be more than that. But my obligation was to my sellers, not those people who were selling. So here's what happened. We actually sat down after we kind of went back and forth for a couple of weeks. We went all masked up. You remember that? We all had our masks on. We sat at the seller's dining room table, and we negotiated this deal from the word go. And with my terrible chicken scratch, and you'll hear me talk about this in a little bit, because it'll tie into another example that I'm going to give you. I hand wrote the entire contract. I had the printed 2T, and I wrote in all the terms, and I'm sitting there trying to make sure it's legible. And then I passed it around, and all the parties signed it. And we got under contract right then and there at that table. It was, to date, the only time that I've had a handwritten contract done exactly that way. It was a really weird transaction. But here's the thing. They, just like Jaleesa, I was telling her earlier, this is another crazy example of just a match made in heaven, right? We hadn't listed their house. They wanted to sell these other people that my clients wanted to buy their house. They were building down in Florida. So they weren't in a hurry, but they wanted to go ahead and sell in case the market shifted. So we got under contract to buy their house. But it wasn't set to close for 6 months. Now, while we were sitting there negotiating, the seller looked at me, and I was representing the buyers. He said, well, Seth, if the prices go up and they continue to climb, are we going to be able to renegotiate this and make y'all pay us more? I said, no. Because if the prices go down, are you going to let us pay you less? He said, no. I said, do you see what I mean? So you're either in it or you're not. He said, okay, fine. So they signed it, and they got under contract. Folks, I don't think I need to tell you how the past 3 years have been market-wise. It climbed and climbed and climbed and climbed. By the time that they were ready to close on this house, we were under contract at $390. It probably should have sold for like $530.
Wow. Good job.
Yeah.
Did you get a bonus? Did you get a bonus?
I didn't. Here's the problem. Because I had worked with these clients so many times, the seller, I think, only offered me 1%, and I just took it, you know? Because I'd done so much business with these people, it was more important for me to have a relationship with them forever, because this is like the 4th or 5th transaction I've had with them. So I just took the 1%. But so we bought it for $590. I'm sorry, $390. It probably should have been $530, but here's the thing. The sellers were screwed. Because if they tried to back out, we could have sued them for specific performance, and we would have won. Because we had a contract stating that they promised to sell it. And so they were stuck. Even if they realized it, I don't know if they did or not, because their agent, no offense, was not as experienced as me. So I don't know if she really realized it or not, but they were screwed. Now here's the thing. We actually, because we were worried about interest rates changing, we closed on it actually on month 5. And we let them have a free month of lease back. We basically went ahead and closed on it and said you can live in it free for a month. Didn't charge them any rent, let them stay in it, because we were worried about things shifting. So after we closed on it, after that month expired, I turned around, and this house that they had to sell that we hadn't listed yet at the time that I looked at it, $455, I turned around and listed it for $425. Got it the same day. So not only did waiting get them this $530,000 house for $390, I turned around and sold this for $425 and made them an extra $70,000 or something like that, just from waiting. And so they made out like bandits. I mean, they made out like absolute bandits between the equity I got them on their new house, between the added value of selling the house later. I mean, I made them stupid money. Not to mention, they're both military. So they purchased with a VA loan. So every single dime they could probably pull out in equity and just use it to spend. And if it paints a picture for you, I'm friends with these clients on Facebook. They just spent like 3 weeks in Europe. So they're still enjoying that money I made them, okay? I mean, they've just made out like absolute bandits. And of course, they think I'm just the best agent in the entire world. But the point of this story is those sellers were screwed. Because that's what I told my buyers. I said, listen, we got $1,000 in due diligence on this thing. If all these things tank and everything hits the fan, you will lose $1,000. That's it. It's not dangerous for you to be under contract, but the way our contract is written, as a seller, you can't get out of it. As a buyer, if you got due diligence, you're out. Right? That's all you lose.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, I think we're going to have time to do the last little activity where I think we'll be able to do it after I point out these last two things. We can do the activity to wrap up the day, and then we'll just go over it first thing tomorrow morning, okay? So here's the last two things in this section before we do a fun-filled activity. Okay, rescission comes into play with contract law, and it's kind of similar to, just voiding the contract as a voidable party. This is basically where you say, okay, because of that mistake, that fraud, that, whatever that made me lack that mutual assent, I want us to go back to where we were. I want us to pretend that these never even happened. And so it's basically negating the contract. That's all it is. When somebody breaches, that's not voiding the contract. That's terminating with remedies. When somebody doesn't do when somebody doesn't fulfill a promise, or that there was this lacking of agreement, a rescission is to say, okay, no. We don't have a contract. I want us to go back to where we were because you lied to me. And so give me my money back and let's just let bygones be bygones. So the hope is that, we will voluntarily just let each other out of it in this rescission. But yet again, if, let's say the seller doesn't return any monies you may have handed over to them, got to get the courts involved, okay? So rescission starts off with just trying to look at both parties and say, we don't have a contract. Let's just part ways and return to where we were. If they won't do that, then court it is. So here's the last note on this section before our fun-filled activity. Let's talk about auction sales, folks. Here's why we got to talk about auction sales. I told you that contracts for the sale of real property have to be in writing. Well, of course, we all realize that real property does get auctioned off. So can you imagine how silly that would be if you had a stack of papers and in order to make a bid, you actually had to write it out on an auction paper. $350. I got $350. Got $375. $375. And they're like, oh wait, hold on. Let me change my contract. Wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have an auction to be an actual written contract. Here's what I mean. When we're dealing with contracts for real property by way of an auction, a bid is as legally binding as a written offer. Of course, it will ultimately be reduced to a written offer as a formality. But it is binding when you bid on it for real estate. Understand the person who talks really fast is called the mere crier. Okay, let me get 300, let me get 300, 325. That's a mere crier. They're an employee of the auctioneer firm. They do not need a license, a broker's license nor an auctioneer's license. They just talk really fast. The auctioneer company that auctions off real estate would need both an auctioneer's license and a real estate license in order to auction off real estate. Now, when we say sold, of course, it's legally binding. It means sold. So the seller is obligated to sell. Buyer is obligated to buy. I told you we would reduce it to a written offer. And then when we're dealing with auctions, we have with reserve and without reserve. Think of it this way. With reserve is we reserve the right to not sell it unless it hits this price. So in other words, if we don't hit a minimum, we might not sell it to you. Probably won't. Without reserve says we will sell it for whatever price we get regardless of what it is. Okay, and that is with reserve and without reserve. But just understand, because we do auction off real property, that it has special exceptions to some of these rules, because we have to understand that it would be impossible to put in a written offer on an auction sale. So it is still legally binding. It would just be reduced to writing thereafter.